Orson Ellsworth shoved the door open so hard it cracked against the inside wall, and Mara didn't even flinch anymore. She'd stopped flinching around him weeks ago, which he seemed to hate more than anything. "Sign it," he said, dropping a folded document onto her kitchen table. It landed next to a bowl of dried beans she'd been sorting. "Today, not tomorrow. Today." Mara looked at the paper, then back at her beans. "No. You're living in a shack washing strangers' drawers." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down like he owned the place, which, technically, was exactly what he was trying to arrange. Gideon would be ashamed. That one landed. She felt it in her chest, but she kept her hands moving, picking through the beans, flicking bad ones aside. "Get out of my house, Orson." He smiled. It wasn't a pleasant thing to see. "Sign the paper, Mara, or I'll make sure that court ruling takes another 2 years. You'll be washing laundry until your hands fall off." She stood up, walked to the door, and held it open. After a long moment, Orson picked up his document, tucked it under his arm, and walked out. At the threshold, he turned back. "You're not as strong as you think," he said. Mara closed the door in his face. Then she stood with her back against it, hands pressed flat against the wood, and breathed until her heart stopped hammering. If this story already has your attention, if you're the kind of person who believes a woman's worst season doesn't have to be her last chapter, then hit that subscribe button right now, because stories like Mara's are what this channel is built for. New stories every week. Like this video, leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's get back to Mara. She didn't sleep well that night. She hadn't slept well in 8 months, not since the deputy came to her door with his hat in his hands and that particular look men wear when they have to deliver bad news to a woman alone. Careful, a little relieved, it wasn't their job to fix it, already edging back toward the door before he'd finished talking. Gideon was gone. Horse threw him into the ravine off the North Trail. Probably instant. Probably didn't suffer. Probably. That word had lived in her chest ever since, like a splinter she couldn't reach. She lay on her side on the narrow bed. She'd moved to the smaller bedroom after the first month, couldn't make herself stay in the larger one. And listened to the cottonwood outside scrape its branches against the eave. Wind off the mountains came down sharp and cold at night, even in early spring. The cottage wasn't well insulated. She could feel it in the floorboards. Orson wanted the ranch. She'd known that before Gideon was cold in the ground. Ellsworth land had been in the family 3 generations, and Gideon was the one who'd built it into something real. The cattle operation, the water rights, the northern range that ran all the way up to Blackstone Gorge. It was substantial. Not Denver money, but in Red Willow Crossing it made the Ellsworth name mean something. And now Gideon was gone, and Orson, who'd spent 20 years resenting his younger cousin's success from a distance, had produced a claim through the territorial court suggesting the ranch had been improperly deeded and rightfully reverted to the older branch of the family. Mara's lawyer, she'd had to borrow money to retain him, said it was a weak claim, said it would likely fail. Likely. Another splinter. The case had been grinding through court for 8 months. Meanwhile, the ranch was frozen. She couldn't sell cattle, couldn't access the accounts. She'd had to let the hands go in October, all 3 of them, and she'd stood in the yard watching them ride out with their bedrolls and their polite, pitying expressions, and she'd kept her face composed until they were gone. And then she'd walked behind the cottage and put her forehead against the cottonwood tree and given herself exactly 4 minutes. Then she'd picked up the first basket of laundry. She'd advertised quietly, discreetly. She was not the first woman in the territory to do such work, and she would not be the last. The money wasn't enough. It was never enough, but it covered flour and firewood and the lawyer's retainer, and that was what had to be true. So that's what it was. She heard Orson's voice in her head. "You're not as strong as you think." She pressed her face into the pillow. She was so tired. Morning came the way it always did in the mountains, fast and cold and indifferent. Mara was up before full light, had water heating on the stove, had the first basket sorted by the time the sun cleared the eastern ridge. She worked behind the cottage. There was a flat area between the fence and the cottonwood that got good sun from mid-morning on, and she'd strung lines between the fence posts and the tree. It wasn't dignified exactly, but it was honest, and she'd decided early on that dignity and honesty were different things, and she'd pick honesty every time. She heard the horse before she saw it, the same sound every morning for the past 3 weeks. A big animal, steady gait, not in a hurry. She didn't look up right away. She'd learned that much. If she looked up every time something moved on the road, she'd never get anything done. But then the horse slowed, and a voice said, "Morning." She looked up. Bram Calder was sitting easy on a big gray gelding, forearm resting on the saddle horn. He was broad through the shoulders and had the kind of weathered look that came from years of actual outdoor work rather than the cultivated roughness some men affected. Dark hair going a little silver at the temples. He was maybe 34, 35. She'd seen him around town for years without knowing much about him. He ran cattle on the eastern side of the county, had a modest operation, kept to himself mostly. "Mr. Calder," she said, "you don't have to keep calling me that." He said it the same way he said it every morning, not pressing it, just mentioning. "You don't have to keep slowing down," she said, same as every morning. He looked at the fence line. She'd had a post leaning for 2 weeks and hadn't had time or tools to fix it properly. "I could get that post set before I head out," he said. "I'll manage." "I know you will. I'm offering anyway." She considered him for a moment. Most people who offered help did it with a particular expression. A mixture of pity and discomfort that made her want to send them away quickly for both their sakes. Bram Calder did not have that expression. He looked at her the way he looked at the fence post. As a practical problem that could use a practical solution, nothing more weighted than that. "I've got the tools," she said finally. "I just haven't had a free hour." "Takes about 15 minutes, he said, "if you've got a maul and a level." She had both. They were in the shed where Gideon had kept everything organized in a way she'd been maintaining mostly out of habit. "Fine," she said. He was off the horse before she'd finished the word, loop of reins over the fence post, going to the gate without asking where it was. She noticed he didn't treat the offer like it had cost him anything. Some men, when they did something generous, wore it visibly. He just walked to the shed and she told him where the mall was, and 20 minutes later the post was solid and true and he was back on his horse. "Thank you," she said. "Yep." He touched his hat brim and moved on down the road. She stood there for a moment with a wet shirt in her hands. "Yep. Not any time or my pleasure, or I'm here if you need anything else, poor thing. Just, yep." She went back to work. It became a pattern without either of them deciding it should. He rode past every morning around the same time. Sometimes he slowed and they exchanged a few words. Sometimes he kept going and just lifted a hand. 3 times in the first 2 weeks he stopped and fixed something. The shed door latch that stuck, a section of fence where a board had split, the drainage channel behind the laundry area that had silted up and was turning the ground soft. He never asked permission. Exactly. He'd say that channel's going to give you trouble or that latch will fail on you in a week, and then look at her and she'd either say yes or no. And if she said yes, he'd do it, and if she said no, he'd nod and move on and not mention it again. She said yes more often than she'd expected. The thing she noticed first was that he talked to her like she could understand things. He didn't explain slowly or use simple language. When he was fixing the drainage channel, he described exactly what the problem was. The grade had shifted, water was backing up instead of running off. He'd put a small redirect in to account for it. And he talked through it like she might have an opinion worth considering, which it turned out she did, because she'd been watching that channel for months and had her own theory about why it was backing up. "It's not just the grade," she said. "The ground's harder here than it used to be. Gideon used to turn it every spring, but I haven't had time." Bram looked at the soil, tested it with the tip of his boot. "You're right," he said, like it wasn't remarkable that she was right. "I'll loosen it before I redirect." He did. She brought him coffee afterward. Black, because she'd noticed he didn't take anything in it. He sat on the fence rail and she leaned against the cottonwood and they drank coffee and talked about like the spring runoff and whether it would be a good year for hay, and it was the most normal conversation she'd had with another person in months. She didn't realize until later that she'd laughed during it. A real laugh, not the polite kind. 2 weeks after the fence post, she was sorting a load of sheets when she heard him coming, and something in the rhythm of the hoofbeats told her he was stopping before he'd even slowed. He pulled up at the gate. "I've been thinking," he said. "About what?" "About what's been on your face the last few days." She looked at him. "Nothing's been on my face." Mara. Just her name. No argument, no elaboration. She dropped the sheet back in the basket. "Orson came by yesterday." What did he want? Same thing he always wants. For me to sign the ranch over and go away quietly. She picked the sheet back up. "He's running out of patience, I think, which means the court ruling might be coming. If it goes your way, that's the end of it. And if it goes his way." Bram was quiet for a moment. "You think it will?" "My lawyer doesn't. But my lawyer also didn't anticipate Orson filing the claim in the first place. So I'm not..." She stopped herself. "I'm not sure how much confidence I should put in likely and probably." He nodded slowly. Something shifted in his expression. Not pity. She'd cataloged his expressions well enough by now to know the difference. This was something more like recognition. "What happened to Gideon's horse?" he said. The question came from an odd direction. She looked at him. "What?" "The horse that was with him when he went off the trail. What happened to it after?" "It came home." She remembered that night clearly. The sound of hooves in the dark, going to the window and seeing Gideon's roan standing at the gate. Her first confused, hopeful thought had been that Gideon had sent it ahead for some reason, that he was walking in behind it. "Came home around midnight. I thought—" She stopped. "Was the horse hurt?" "No." "That's what I thought. It was strange. If it had thrown him badly enough to—" She set the sheet down. "It came home calm. It was eating hay within an hour. It wasn't—" She hadn't said this out loud before, not to anyone. Frightened horses don't behave that way, do they? Bram looked at her steadily. "No," he said, "they don't." The morning felt different suddenly. The ordinary sounds of it, the wind, the distant sound of the creek, a bird somewhere in the cottonwood. All of it seemed to be happening very far away. "The sheriff said it was an accident," she said. "The sheriff said a lot of things fast," Bram said, and then stopped asking questions. She understood what he was suggesting. She'd understood it, actually, in some dark corner of herself for months, had understood it and refused to look directly at it, the way you don't look directly at the sun. "Bram," she stopped, started again. I know. "It's been 8 months. If there was evidence, there might be," he said, "or there might not, but I think it's worth asking." She looked at him. "Why do you care? This isn't your trouble." He was quiet for a moment, then, "I ride past your fence every morning." "That's not an answer." "Sure it is." He picked up his reins. "I'm going to ask around about Hollis Crane. He was the one who found Gideon. You know that?" "I knew his name. I'll let you know what I find." He started to move, then stopped. "And Mara, the court ruling, whichever way it goes, you'll still be you after." She didn't know what to do with that, so she just nodded. He rode on down the road. She stood in the yard for a long time after the sound of his horse faded. 3 days later, he came back with a different look on him. Tighter around the jaw, something working behind his eyes that hadn't been there before. She was at the fence when he rode up, and she knew before he opened his mouth that he'd found something. "Hollis Crane's in Sutter's Creek," Bram said, dropping off his horse. "Working for a freight company now. I talked to him for about an hour yesterday." "And?" He came through the gate, which he only did when he had something to say that wasn't for the road. When Hollis found Gideon at the bottom of the ravine, the saddle was still on the horse. The horse had come back part way up the trail. Hollis saw it first, thought it was loose, went to catch it. He stopped. He noticed the cinch. Mara kept her face still. "What about it?" "It was cut. Not all the way through. Sliced maybe 2/3 through the leather in a place that wouldn't be visible in a quick check. It would hold under normal weight but fail under stress. A sharp turn, a spook, going uphill fast. The morning went very quiet. He told the sheriff," Bram said. "Sheriff Rourke looked at it, said cinches wear and fray, said it was consistent with normal degradation. Filed it as accidental. Hollis disagreed, but Rourke made it clear he wasn't interested in pursuing it." "Rourke and Orson," Mara said slowly. "They've known each other a long time. Since before either of them settled here. Yes." She sat down on the fence rail. She didn't mean to. Her legs just decided. Bram stood 2 feet away and let her think. "Someone cut Gideon's cinch," she said. "That's what it looks like. And Orson files his inheritance claim 6 weeks later, within 40 days of the death." She looked at her hands. They were rough from the work, reddened at the knuckles. She thought about Gideon's hands. Different from hers, bigger, the kind of hands that knew their way around rope and fence and cattle. She thought about the last morning she'd seen him saddling that horse in the early dark, the ordinary sounds of the barn, the ordinary way he'd kissed her forehead and said he'd be back by supper. She thought about someone touching his saddle with a knife. "Mara!" Bram's voice was careful. "I'm all right," she said, which wasn't exactly true, but it was close enough. "You don't have to be all right today." "Yes, I do." She stood up. "What else did Hollis tell you?" Bram looked at her for a moment. Really looked, the way he did when he was taking stock of something. And then he pulled a small folded paper from his shirt pocket. "He wrote it down for me. What he saw, what he told Rourke, what Rourke said back. He's willing to make a formal statement if there's someone to make it to." He held the paper out. "He's been carrying this around for 8 months, Mara. He didn't like how it was handled." She took the paper. "Read it. Hollis's handwriting was slow and careful, a man who'd learned to write later in life and took it seriously because of that. The leather was clean on both sides of the cut. Not frayed, straight edges. I have cut a cinch before to free a trapped animal, and I know what that looks like. She folded it. If we take this to Rourke, he'll dismiss it again, she said. Yes. Is there someone above Rourke? The Territorial Marshal's office in Denver, but we'd need more than one ranch hand statement about a cinch. He paused. We'd need to know what Orson had to gain beyond the ranch itself. We'd need motive that makes the risk worth it. She thought about this. Orson offered me a comfortable house and money to sign. He was very specific about getting me to sign before the court ruling, which suggests he's not confident in his legal claim. Or he wants it settled before something comes to light. The question is what? She was already thinking about the North Range, about Gideon's final months, about the survey work he'd mentioned, the trips to Blackstone Gorge, the way he'd sometimes come home from the Northern Range with that particular crease between his eyebrows that meant he was working something out. I think there's something up there, he'd told her once, on the ridge. She hadn't asked what he meant. She wished now deeply that she had. Gideon kept a field notebook, she said. He always had one in his coat. Measured things, sketched things, wrote notes about the land. Did they find it with the body? The sheriff's report didn't list it. She remembered reading the report 3 times, looking for anything. His coat came back with his personal effects. The notebook wasn't in it. He might have left it somewhere. He might have. She looked north, toward the ridgeline she could see from her yard on clear days. He used to keep supplies at the old line shack on the upper range. Before we let the hands go, they used it when they were working the northern pastures. Bram followed her gaze. You think we should look, he said. Not a question exactly. I think someone might already be looking. That's what worried me about the cottage being searched. He turned back to her sharply. Someone searched your cottage? She hadn't told him this. She hadn't told anyone. 3 weeks ago, I came home and things were moved, not ransacked. Careful, like they were trying not to leave obvious signs. But I know where I put things. She paused. Gideon's ledgers from the ranch office were gone through. I could tell by how they were stacked. What's in those ledgers? Financial records, land notes, supply records. She stopped. And any surveys he might have commissioned or recorded. Bram was quiet for a moment. Mara, if Orson already knows what he's looking for, then we need to find it first, she said. The words surprised her a little, the firmness of them. 4 months ago, she might have said them, but they would have come out shaky. Now they came out flat and certain. She saw something happen in Bram's expression, a kind of settling. When do you want to go? Day after tomorrow. I've got laundry committed tomorrow. She glanced at him. You don't have to come. I know. This is not your problem. You said that already. He picked up his reins. I'll meet you here at first light, day after tomorrow. I know that ridge better than you might think. I ran cattle up that way 2 seasons ago. Bram. He stopped. Why are you doing this? He thought about it honestly, which she appreciated. He wasn't a man who gave reflexive answers. Because 8 months ago, someone took something from you and nobody looked at it properly. And because... He stopped, looked at her directly. Because I think you might be in real danger if Orson decides the careful approach isn't working anymore. That's a practical reason, she said. I'm a practical man. Is that all it is? He was quiet for a beat too long. No, he said, and he left before she could respond to that. She stood at the fence for a long time after he was gone, her hand on the post he'd set solid and true 3 weeks ago, and she tried to sort out what she felt about a man who showed up every morning and fixed things and asked honest questions and then said no with no explanation and rode away. She wasn't sure she had a category for him. She wasn't sure she needed one yet. That evening, she sat at the kitchen table with Gideon's ledgers open in front of her. She hadn't looked at them carefully since before the legal dispute. It had felt too much like going through his things, which she'd been doing in stages over the months. A drawer 1 week, the wardrobe the next, small measured doses of finality. She worked through the land records first. Gideon had been meticulous. Every pasture, every fence line, every water source was documented with measurements and notes. She could read his whole relationship with the land in these pages, the places he thought were underused, the sections he was considering for expansion, the rough sketches of planned improvements. She found the North Range entries about 2 hours in. They began about 14 months before his death. At first, they were routine, pasture assessments, water availability, estimates of carrying capacity. But around 8 months before he died, something changed in the entries. They got more detailed, more focused. The notes shifted from cattle considerations to something else. He was writing about the geology of the ridge, about rock formations, about water patterns that didn't match what he expected. Seepage on the eastern face, wrong direction for spring melt, something else feeding it. Ridge soil different from valley, heavier. Need a proper look. Going to ask tenant to ride up with me next month. Don't mention to Orson. She sat with that for a moment. Gideon had been keeping information from Orson, which meant he'd had a reason not to trust him, even months before whatever he'd found. Don't mention to O. She turned to the final pages of the last ledger. They were more sparse. Gideon had been writing quickly toward the end, the handwriting less neat than usual. Tenant confirmed it. He thinks significant. Wants to survey properly before we say anything. Told him to be discreet. Not ready to move on this yet. And then, 2 weeks before his death, a single line in the margin. O asked about the North Survey. How does he know? Mara set the ledger down. She looked at the table. At her hands. Tenant. She didn't know a tenant. A surveyor, evidently. Gideon had been having the North Range surveyed for something specific, and he'd been keeping it from Orson, and somehow Orson had found out anyway. And 2 weeks after writing that line, Gideon had ridden out on a horse with a cut cinch and never come home. She closed the ledger. Outside, the cottonwood was scraping the eave in the night wind, same as always, the same sound she'd fallen asleep to for 8 years of marriage and 8 months of widowhood. She sat at the table for a long time. Then she got up, found a piece of paper, and wrote down every name and date and detail from those final ledger entries in her own hand, careful and thorough, so there was a copy no one could take. She was not going to lose this. She didn't know yet what she was fighting for. She didn't know what Gideon had found on that ridge, what it was worth, why it had cost him his life. But she was going to find out. She folded the paper and tucked it into the lining of her boot. Then she banked the fire, turned down the lamp, and went to bed. She slept better than she had in 8 months. She was up before the sky had any color in it. Not because she'd slept poorly. She'd actually slept, which still surprised her when she thought about it, but because she'd woken at 4 in the morning with the feeling that she'd forgotten something important, and it had taken her a full minute lying in the dark to understand that the feeling wasn't about forgetting something. It was about knowing too much, about what those ledger entries meant, about the name tenant and the words don't mention to O written in Gideon's careful hand. She made coffee, drank it standing at the window, watching the eastern ridge turn from black to gray, and tried to think practically. Tenant was a surveyor. Gideon had hired him to look at the North Range. Whatever Tenant had confirmed had been significant enough that Gideon wanted to keep it quiet, and whatever it was, Orson had somehow gotten wind of it. 2 weeks later, Gideon was dead. She needed to find Tenant. She turned from the window and started on the laundry she'd promised Mrs. Aldrich for that afternoon. She carried the first load out to the lines in the gray pre-dawn and started scrubbing at the washboard with the same mechanical rhythm she'd been doing for months, and she let her mind run while her hands worked. She knew most of the people in Red Willow Crossing. It wasn't a large settlement, maybe 400 people in the town proper, more scattered across the surrounding ranches and farms. A surveyor named Tenant should be findable. Either he was local, in which case she might know his face without knowing his name, or he'd come in from somewhere else, in which case he'd have had to stable a horse and find a room. She could ask at the livery, at the hotel, at the land office. She was 3/4 of the way through the basket when she heard hooves on the road and looked up to find it was not yet first light and Bram was a day early. She straightened, pushing her hair back with her wrist. He pulled up and looked at her. Took in the washboard and the basket and the half-hung lines. "I thought we were going tomorrow," she said. "We are." He got down. "I found something this morning I thought you should know about before we go." Her hand stilled on the shirt she was holding. "What?" He came through the gate the way he did now, without asking, set himself against the cottonwood with his arms crossed, and she noticed his jaw was tight again. "I went into town yesterday evening to pick up fencing supplies. Stopped at the saloon for a drink. I don't make a habit of it, but Horace Dunbar was there, and Horace talks when he's had 2 beers, and Horace runs the land office." "I know who Horace is. He mentioned that someone had been pulling territorial land survey records, old ones. North Range specifically, up toward Blackstone Gorge." He paused. "About 2 weeks ago." "Who was pulling them?" He didn't see the man directly. Clerk handled it. But Horace described the clerk's description. Tall, well-dressed, city coat. Not someone local. someone Orson sent. That would be my read. He looked at her steadily. Mara, if Orson is already pulling the territorial survey records, he knows about whatever's on that ridge. And he's trying to understand the full picture before the court rules. She thought of the ledger entry. O asked about the North Survey. How does he know? Gideon found out Orson knew, she said slowly. That's the last thing he wrote, that Orson had somehow found out about the survey. How would Orson have found out? I don't know. A ranch hand, maybe? Someone who saw Gideon up on the ridge more than usual and mentioned it. She paused. Or someone Tennant talked to. Tennant. The surveyor Gideon hired. His name is in the ledgers. I need to find him. She looked at Bram. Do you know anyone by that name? In the county? He thought for a moment. There's a Chester Tennant I knew of. He did survey work for some of the ranches south of here about 3 years back. I don't know where he is now. Could have been him. Gideon wouldn't have gone to someone he didn't know or couldn't trust. I can ask at the land office, more carefully than Horace. Not yet. She went back to scrubbing, not because she'd forgotten the conversation, but because standing still while she thought always made her feel more panicked. If someone connected to Orson is watching the land office, we don't want to tip them that we're looking. Bram was quiet for a moment. You've been thinking about this a long time, he said. 8 months, she said. I just didn't know what I was thinking about. He watched her work for a bit, and then without any preamble, he reached into the basket, picked up a wet shirt, and started wringing it out over the line. She stopped. What are you doing? Helping. He shook the shirt out and draped it on the line, not perfectly. The collar flopped sideways, but functional. You've got a full basket and we're burning daylight talking. You don't need to. I know I don't need to. He reached for another shirt. You're going to tell me to stop? She looked at him. He was already working, not looking at her, not making anything of it. She went back to the washboard. They worked in silence for a while, which should have been awkward and somehow wasn't. The sky was going pink and gold over the eastern ridge. A crow was doing something loud and argumentative in the upper branches of the cottonwood. Why did you really come by today? She said. You could have told me about the land records tomorrow. He hung a sheet, wrestling with it briefly in the morning wind. I wanted to make sure you were all right after yesterday, he said. I told you I was all right. You told me you were all right while you were figuring out that someone probably murdered your husband. I wanted to check. She was quiet. That's not a practical reason, she said finally. No, he agreed. It's not. The crow kept arguing with itself overhead. The shirts dripped in the morning light. Mara worked through the last of the basket and tried to decide what to do with a man who showed up before dawn to wring out laundry and admit he'd been worried about her. She didn't have a decision by the time the basket was empty. They left the next morning before first light, as planned. Mara had told Mrs. Aldrich she'd have her delivery delayed by a day and absorbed the woman's tight-mouthed displeasure without apology. She'd packed a small bag, food for a day, a canteen, the folded copy of the ledger notes she'd been keeping in her boot, and Gideon's old field compass, which she'd found in the back of a drawer and pocketed without entirely knowing why. Bram brought his gray gelding and a second horse, a steady brown mare he said was borrowed from a neighbor. You didn't have to bring a horse, Mara said, looking at the mare. The line shack is 9 miles up. You want to walk that? She didn't, so she mounted the mare and they rode out in the early dark without talking much, which suited her. The trail north was one she'd ridden dozens of times with Gideon, checking the upper pastures, moving cattle, fixing fence. She knew it well enough that the dark didn't concern her, but she hadn't ridden it since before he died, and there was a particular quality to familiar things after loss. They held the shape of everything that used to happen in them. She kept her eyes on the trail and breathed through it. They picked up the North Fork about 2 miles out and the terrain started rising. Scrub pine gave way to taller timber and the air got colder, and the horse's breath made small clouds in the pre-dawn. Bram rode a length ahead where the trail narrowed and she was glad he wasn't watching her face. How far to the line shack from here, she said, when the sky started showing the first gray edges. 3 more miles, maybe a little over. He glanced back. You all right? Stop asking me that. When you stop looking like something's wrong, I'll stop asking. Nothing's wrong. I'm just... She paused. I used to ride this trail with Gideon. He nodded. Let it be what it was. She appreciated that too. He didn't say, I know, or I'm sorry, or any of the things people said that meant well but landed like furniture you kept walking into in the dark. They rode the rest of the distance in silence. The line shack was a one-room structure made of unpeeled logs, chinked with clay that had mostly held with a sod roof that was doing its best. Gideon had built it 20 years ago with his father, back when the Ellsworth operation first expanded to the northern range, and it had been maintained just well enough to be usable and no more. The door was not locked. There was no lock. There was a leather strap looped through a drilled hole to hold it shut against wind. Bram pulled the strap and the door swung inward. The smell was cold ashes and damp wood and the particular dusty emptiness of a space that hadn't held a person in many months. There was a narrow bunk against one wall, a small iron stove, a rough table with 2 stumps for chairs, and along the back wall, a set of wooden shelves holding the things you'd need in an emergency. Canned goods, matches, a tin of axle grease, a folded blanket. Mara went straight to the shelves. She didn't know exactly what she was looking for, she just knew how Gideon thought about things. He'd have wanted it somewhere out of sight but accessible, somewhere that would survive if the shack got wet, somewhere that made sense to him specifically. She started on the far left, moved everything forward, checked behind it, replaced it. Worked right. Bram checked under the bunk and behind the stove. "Nothing here," he said. "Keep looking." She moved to the second shelf. Canned peaches, a rusted tin of something, a roll of oilcloth. She stopped. Oilcloth. She unrolled it. Inside was a notebook, smaller than the ledger she'd found at the house, more battered. Field notebook, the kind with a stiff cover and paper that could take some weather. Gideon's initials were scratched into the front cover with a nail or the tip of a knife. G.E. Her hands were not entirely steady when she opened it. Bram. He was beside her in 3 steps. She turned pages carefully. The early entries were what she expected. Measurements, sketches, notes about the northern pastures, cattle counts, fence notations, the handwriting of a man doing ordinary work. Then the notes changed. It happened around a third of the way in, and it happened because of a word. Outcropping. East face of North Ridge. Unusual rock outcropping at approximately 4,200 feet. Distinct from surrounding formation. Color difference notable in afternoon light. Going to bring tenant up. The next entry was 2 weeks later. Tenant confirmed. Galena formation consistent with significant silver deposit. He's seen this pattern in Nevada, says this is the same. Wants to do full bore samples before making official assessment, but preliminary estimate is substantial. Possibly very substantial. Mara read the word silver and felt something drop through her stomach. Very substantial. Silver, Bram said quietly. He was reading over her shoulder. She kept turning pages. Tenant says we need to file a mineral claim immediately to protect the find. I told him to wait. I need to understand the full extent before I bring lawyers into it. Also concerned about O. He's been asking too many questions about the North Range. Not sure how he knows to ask. And then, in the last week of entries, the handwriting getting faster and less neat. Tenant says he can't wait much longer on the formal claim. Told him 2 more weeks. Need to talk to a territorial land lawyer first. Someone not connected to anyone in Red Willow Crossing. O confronted me directly yesterday. Asked me what I'd found on the ridge. I played ignorant. Don't think he believed me. Going to ride up to check on the camp tomorrow and then go to Durango next week. Mara's throat was tight. Tomorrow was the day Gideon had ridden out on the horse with the cut cinch. He'd never made it to Durango. He'd never made it back from the ridge. She closed the notebook carefully, and her hands were shaking now. Not with grief exactly, but with the specific cold clarity of understanding something fully for the first time. Orson had known, had confronted Gideon directly, had been told nothing, hadn't believed nothing, and had decided that the safest course was to make sure Gideon never filed that mineral claim or talked to a territorial lawyer. A silver deposit, possibly very substantial. That was what Gideon's life had been worth to his cousin. Mara, Bram's voice was gentle but direct. I'm all right, she said, and this time she meant it differently than she'd meant it before. Not, I'm managing or don't worry about me. She meant, I am clear-headed. I know what this is. I know what I need to do. She wrapped the notebook back in its oilcloth. We're taking this, she said. Yes. And we need to find Tenant. Yes. And we need to be careful going back down, because if someone has been watching this ridge, I've been watching the trail since we turned onto the North Fork, Bram said. We weren't followed. She looked at him. You were watching for that? I thought it was possible. She tucked the wrapped notebook into her bag. How long have you been thinking Orson was dangerous? Since the second morning you told me he'd been by. He said it flatly, without drama. Mara, a man who's willing to take a cousin's ranch through fraudulent legal claims and put this kind of pressure on a widow alone. That man has already decided other people don't matter as much as what he wants. That's a particular kind of dangerous. She shouldered her bag. "Let's go," she said. They went. The ride back down was tense in a way the ride up hadn't been. Not because anything happened. The trail was clear, the morning was ordinary, a pair of mule deer watched them pass from a hillside without alarm, but because she knew what was in her bag now, and she kept thinking about what would happen if someone took it. Bram stayed closer on the way down, road level with her where the trail allowed. "Tell me about this tenant," he said, once they'd cleared the timber line and the settlement was visible in the valley below. "I only know the name from the ledger. Chester Tennant, you said." "That's the one I know of. He was based out of Alamosa, last I heard. Survey work for mining operations, mostly." "Would you know how to reach him?" "I know a man who might know. Ezra Polk, he runs the freighting office in town. He knows every transient worker who's moved through the county in the last decade." Bram paused. "But again, if we're being careful about who we approach, Ezra Polk is not Orson's man," Mara said. She was fairly certain about this. Polk was an older man, crotchety and independent, the kind of person who didn't have much patience for the powerful. "I can talk to him." "Alone?" "I go into town alone every week. It won't look unusual." He thought about it. "What about the notebook? Where are you keeping it?" "Not at the cottage." The break-in had settled that. "Is there somewhere on your property?" He was quiet for a moment. "You trust me with that?" he said. "You already know what's in it, and you haven't done anything with the information except try to help me." She glanced at him. "Did I misread you?" "No." He said it simply. "I'll put it in my lockbox. Nobody goes in my house but me." She handed him the bag. He took it without ceremony, tucked it into his saddlebag, and they rode the rest of the way to the valley without another word about it. Ezra Polk's freighting office was a long, low building on the western edge of town that smelled permanently of sawdust and machine oil and the particular thick sweetness of too many leather harnesses in one place. Mara went the following morning after Bram had headed south toward his own property and the first laundry run was done, and she had 2 hours before the next. Polk was behind his counter doing something with a ledger when she came in. He looked up, not smiling, which was his version of a warm greeting. "Mrs. Ellsworth," he said. "Mr. Polk." She came to the counter. "I'm looking for a man, a surveyor, Chester Tennant. I'm told he's done work in the county." Polk set his pen down, looked at her with the flat assessment of a man who'd been in business long enough to recognize when someone was asking a question for a reason. "What kind of work are you thinking of hiring him for?" "Land assessment on the North Range," she said, which was true enough. "I'm considering whether to make improvements up there, but I need a proper survey first." This was a plausible reason for a woman managing a ranch, even a frozen one. She watched Polk turn it over. "Tennant," he said. "Chester Tennant. He came through maybe 15 months ago. Stayed about 3 weeks." "Do you know how to reach him?" "He was working out of Alamosa. I've got a contact there. Freighting company he used for his equipment. I could send a message." "I'd appreciate that." Polk picked up his pen again, made a note on a separate slip of paper. "What name should I give if he asks who's inquiring?" "Mara Ellsworth." He looked up. "Gideon's widow?" "Yes." Something moved across the old man's face, not pity. Something more like recognition. The look of a man who'd been waiting to see if someone was going to start asking the right questions. "I'll send today," he said. She thanked him and left. On the boardwalk outside, she stood for a moment in the cool morning air and checked her breathing, slow, even. She was getting better at this, at doing the thing and feeling the fear separately, not letting them interfere with each other. She was walking toward the far end of the street when she heard her name. She stopped. Orson Ellsworth was coming out of the hotel, and he had the surveyor's coat man beside him. Tall, well-dressed, city coat. She kept her face empty, which was something she'd been practicing. Orson spotted her across the street, and something happened behind his eyes. A quick calibration, the kind of look a man gets when he's figuring out how much someone knows and how to respond. He crossed toward her. "Mara." His voice was pleasant. It was always pleasant in public. "You look tired. Are you managing all right?" "Fine," she said. "Thank you." "I heard you were up in the North Range yesterday." He said it lightly, almost carelessly. Her stomach dropped, but she kept her face. "I needed to check on the line shack," she said. "It's been sitting empty. I wanted to make sure it was still sound before the next winter." "Of course," he smiled. The smile had never reached anything behind it. "Mara, my offer still stands. A comfortable house, a fair sum. It's a better situation than you're in now. The court hasn't ruled yet. No, he said. It hasn't. The surveyor's coat man was standing a few feet back, watching her. She didn't look directly at him. She looked at Orson and kept her voice level. If that's all, she said, I've got work to get back to. She walked past him. She did not run. She did not look back. She walked to the end of the street, turned the corner, put her back against the wall of the dry goods store, and breathed. He knew she'd been on the North Range. Someone had been watching. Or someone had talked. One of the two, and either way, it meant Orson was paying attention. That the careful approach hadn't changed his awareness of her. That she'd been observed even when she'd thought she was moving quietly. And the surveyor's coat man, not sent to pull records, apparently, still here, still working. She needed to move faster. She pushed off the wall and walked back toward the cottage with her hands loose at her sides and her mind already 3 steps ahead. She got back to find Bram at her fence. He'd ridden back, which meant he'd ridden south and then north again, and she didn't ask him why. Orson was in town, she said, with the man Horace described, the one pulling land records. Bram's expression didn't change much, but his jaw did. He knows you went to the North Range, she said. How? I don't know, but he told me directly, phrased like a question. I said I was checking the line shack. She looked at him. Do you think he believed it? No, Bram said. Do you? No. She went to the gate. We need Hollis Crane to make a formal statement, not just the written one he gave you, a real one, in front of someone with authority to act on it. The territorial marshal. Yes, but Rourke can't know we're contacting Denver before we've already done it. If he warns Orson, Rourke's not going to like being gone around. I know. She looked at him directly. I'm not worried about what Rourke likes. Bram looked at her for a moment. Something that was almost a smile moved across his face, but didn't quite get there. All right, he said. I'll ride to Sutter's Creek tomorrow and talk to Hollis, see if he'll make the trip to Denver to give his statement. Take the notebook with you. Mara, if Orson knew I was on the North Range, he might try the cottage again. I don't want it here. She held his gaze. You said nobody goes in your house but you. That's still true. Then it's safer there. And if Hollis will go to Denver, he should take it with him. Or you should go with him. She paused. I can't go. If I leave town while the court ruling is pending, Orson's lawyers will argue I've abandoned the claim. You've thought this through. I've been thinking about it since Blackstone Gorge. She looked at her hands. Bram, when Polk reaches Tennant, if Tennant is willing to come forward, that's 3 witnesses. The cinch, the notebook, the surveyor. That's enough to force a proper investigation. It might be enough to force one, he said. Whether Rourke runs it or someone else does depends on how much pressure Denver is willing to put on a small county sheriff. Then we need Denver to want to put pressure on him. She looked at him. Orson has been covering this up with Rourke's help. That's not just murder, that's corruption in office. Bram was quiet. You're talking about going after the sheriff, he said. I'm talking about going after the man who had Gideon killed. If Rourke is in the way of that, then yes. She paused. Are you still in? He looked at her for a long moment, not calculating, just looking. You know what I said the first morning I stopped at your fence? He said. She thought back. You said morning. Before that, she'd almost forgotten. She'd been wringing out a shirt and he'd slowed his horse and said, You said I didn't look like I needed help, she said. I said you didn't look like the type who wanted to be treated like you needed it. He straightened from the fence. I was right. She felt something warm move through her chest and did her best to ignore it because there was too much work ahead of them for her to be distracted by how a man looked at her. Ride to Sutter's Creek tomorrow, she said. Be careful. Always. Bram. She stopped him before he reached his horse. If Hollis has been sitting on that statement for 8 months because he was afraid of Rourke, what makes you think he'll go to Denver now? Bram turned back. Because now someone's asking him to, he said simply. And because you're still standing here. Sometimes that's enough. He mounted up and rode south. She watched him go, and the afternoon was quiet around her, and she had 4 more hours of laundry to finish, and she went and did it. But she kept the compass in her pocket the whole time, running her thumb over its brass edge the way she used to when she was a girl and needed something solid to hold on to. And she thought about silver in the mountain, and a knife on a cinch, and a man riding past her fence every morning without pity, just steadiness, just showing up. She'd been a widow for 8 months. She'd been fighting for twice as long as she'd known it. And Orson Ellsworth, she thought, had no idea who he was dealing with anymore. Hollis Crane was a small man who looked like he'd been left out in the weather too long. Not battered exactly, but compressed, like years of hard seasons had pressed him down into something denser than he'd started as. He was sitting on a crate outside the Sutter's Creek freight office when Bram rode up, doing something with a length of rope, and he looked up with the particular wariness of a man who'd learned that visitors usually meant trouble of one kind or another. Bram got down from his horse slowly, giving the man time to read him. "You Hollis Crane?" he said. "Depends on who's asking." "Bram Calder. I run cattle east of Red Willow Crossing. I'm not here on anyone's behalf except Mara Ellsworth's." Something shifted in Hollis's face at that name. Not fear, something more complicated. Relief mixed with guilt, maybe. The look of a man who'd been expecting a conversation for a long time and still wasn't sure he wanted it. "She send you?" "She knows I'm here." Bram tied his horse to the post and came a few steps closer. "I read the statement you wrote out about the cinch." Hollis looked down at the rope in his hands, turned it over once. "Rourke said it was where. You said it wasn't." "I said a lot of things to Rourke. Didn't do much good." He set the rope down on the crate beside him. "What does Mrs. Ellsworth want?" "She wants you to make that statement formally, to the Territorial Marshal's office in Denver." Hollis was quiet for a long moment. "That's a different thing than telling a county sheriff," he said. "Yes, it is." "Rourke's going to know it was me. Rourke's going to have bigger problems than you by then, if this goes the way we're working toward." Bram crouched down to be at eye level with him. "Hollis, we found Gideon's field notebook. He was surveying a silver deposit on the North Ridge, a big one. Orson knew about it and confronted Gideon 2 weeks before he died." Hollis stared at him. "Silver," he said. "The kind of silver that makes a man willing to cut a cinch." Hollis pressed his mouth into a thin line. He looked out at the street, a quiet one, dust and a few horses, nothing remarkable, and Bram let him look. "I liked Gideon Ellsworth," Hollis said finally. "He was a fair man, paid on time, didn't ask more than he should, always treated the hands decent." He paused. "When I found him at the bottom of that ravine, I thought it was wrong. Everything about it was wrong. The horse too calm, the cinch cut clean." He stopped, and Rourke looked right at it and told me I was seeing things. "You weren't." "I know I wasn't." His voice had gotten harder. "I've been sitting on that written statement for 8 months, wondering if I was ever going to find a reason to do something with it. My wife said let it go, said it wasn't our trouble." "Is she right?" Hollis picked up the rope again, not to work it, just to have something in his hands. "She's not wrong, but she's not entirely right either." He looked at Bram. "If I go to Denver, I go alone? I'll go with you, and we'll have Gideon's notebook to back you up. And there's a surveyor named Chester Tennant who confirmed the silver find. We're trying to reach him now." "Tennant?" Hollis nodded slowly. "I saw him up at the ranch a couple of times. Quiet man. Serious. If he comes forward too, that's 3 independent sources pointing the same direction." Hollis was quiet. Then, "When?" "Soon as possible. Orson's moving. He's got someone in Red Willow Crossing pulling land records, and he knows Mara was on the North Range. He's getting nervous, which makes him dangerous." "How's she doing?" Hollis asked it like the question had been sitting in his chest for a while. "Mrs. Ellsworth, she was..." He stopped. "She was always steady, steadier than most people knew. But 8 months washing other people's laundry, she's steadier than ever," Bram said, and he meant it, and something in his voice made Hollis look at him with a different kind of attention. "You her friend?" Hollis said carefully. "Yes." "Just a friend?" Bram stood up. "We going to Denver or not?" Hollis Crane almost smiled. "Give me a day to settle things here. I'll meet you at the North Road Thursday morning." Back in Red Willow Crossing, Mara received the message from Ezra Polk on Wednesday afternoon. It was brief, written in the freight operator's cramped hand. Tennant was reached. He's in Alamosa. Says he remembers the Ellsworth survey and he has documentation. Will travel to Denver if formal proceedings are opened. Needs a reason to think it'll go somewhere. She read it 3 times standing at Polk's counter, then folded it into her pocket. "Did he say anything else?" she asked. Polk looked at her over his glasses. "He said, and I'm quoting here, tell her to make sure someone in Denver is already expecting him before he rides up there cold. He's careful." "That's fair." She thought for a moment. "Can you reach him again?" "I can." Tell him the territorial marshal's office will be contacted before he arrives. Tell him there will be sworn statements from at least 2 other witnesses. She paused. Tell him Mara Ellsworth sends her word. Polk wrote it down without asking questions. She walked out of the freight office and stood in the afternoon sun and did the math in her head. Bram and Hollis leaving Thursday. 2 days to Denver on horseback. She needed to write to the marshal's office herself. Today, tonight, to make sure there was someone expecting them. She needed to do it without Rourke knowing. She'd send it with the private mail courier, not through the town post. The town postmaster was a chatty man. She walked home fast, sat down at the table, and wrote the most important letter of her life. She wasn't a lawyer. She knew that. She didn't try to write like one. She wrote plainly who Gideon Ellsworth was, when he died, what the circumstances were, what evidence existed, what the relationship between Orson Ellsworth and Sheriff Clay Rourke appeared to be. She named Hollis Crane and Chester Tennant as witnesses. She described the notebook. She used specific dates from the ledger entries. Then she wrote, I am the widow of the man who was killed for what he found on that mountain. I am asking you to let the evidence speak before anyone with a reason to bury it gets the opportunity. She sealed it, addressed it to the office of the territorial marshal in Denver, and paid the private courier double his rate to leave before dawn and speak to no one about his errand. Then she sat at the table in the quiet cottage and realized she was shaking slightly. Not from fear, from the particular exhaustion that comes from holding yourself together through a long period of impossible tasks and only noticing the effort afterward. She made tea, she drank it, she went to bed. Orson came the next morning. She heard his horse at the gate and looked out the window and knew immediately from the way he rode, fast, not his usual deliberate approach, that something had changed. She didn't go to the door right away. She stood in the kitchen and looked at the room around her with the specific awareness of a person taking stock. Everything she needed from the cottage was documented elsewhere. The notebook was with Bram. The letter was already gone. She went to the door. Orson didn't bother with pleasantries this time. I know you went to Polk, he said. He was on the step, not waiting for an invitation, which he'd never done before. I know you're looking for Tennant. He was guessing on the last part. She could see it. The slight forward lean that meant he was throwing weight on uncertain ground. I needed a freight route assessed, she said, for when the ranch is operational again. Stop. His voice dropped. Stop playing this game with me. You found something on that ridge. You went looking for something specific and you found it. He stepped closer. Do you understand what you're doing? Do you understand what you're poking at? I'm managing my husband's property while the courts sort out your fraudulent claim. He grabbed her arm. It happened fast. Too fast for her to step back. And his grip was tight, not brutal, but definitive, the grip of a man who'd decided not to bother being careful anymore. Sign the paper, he said. Very quiet, very clear. Today. Whatever you think you found, whatever you think you know, none of it will matter once you've signed. I'll make sure you're comfortable. I'll make sure— Let go of my arm, she said. Mara, let go of my arm, Orson, or I'll start screaming, and I'll keep screaming until every person on this road has seen you standing on my step with your hand on me. He let go. He took a step back, looked at her. And what she saw in his face frightened her more than the grip had. Not anger, but something colder, an assessment. The kind of look a man gives when he's deciding whether a problem has moved past a certain threshold. I'm trying to handle this without it becoming something worse, he said. You had Gideon's cinch cut, she said. She hadn't planned to say it. She hadn't decided this was the moment. But he'd grabbed her arm and she was done being careful about what she said to him in private. His face didn't change. That was the worst part. It didn't crumple or flush or go blank with shock. He just looked at her with those calculating eyes and was quiet. That's a very serious accusation, he said finally. It's a very serious thing that was done. You have no evidence of anything. She kept her face still. I have enough. She didn't know if that was true yet. She knew it was close to true. She said it because she needed him to think it was fully true, and because she needed him to know that she knew, and because 8 months of laundry and fear and grief had burned away whatever instinct she might once have had to soften the truth for the comfort of a man who didn't deserve comfort. Orson looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, You should have signed the paper, Mara, and walked back to his horse. She closed the door, stood in the kitchen. Her arm hurt where he'd gripped it. She pressed her other hand over the place and breathed. She'd made a mistake, maybe, showing him she knew before everything was in place. Before Hollis and Bram had reached Denver. But she'd also sent the letter last night, and Hollis and Bram were already on the road north, and Chester Tennant had documentation in Alamosa, and Orson didn't know any of that. Only that she'd been asking about a surveyor and she'd been on the North Range. She'd given away her knowledge, but not her evidence. There was still time, she hoped. She didn't see Bram for 4 days, which was the longest stretch since he'd started riding past her fence. She noticed the absence more than she'd expected to. Not because she needed someone to check on her, she'd been managing on her own for months and she was capable of continuing. But because she'd gotten used to the shape of the morning that included him in it, the hoofbeats, the slowing, the brief exchange, she'd gotten used to having someone to think out loud with. She told herself she was noticing his absence the same way you noticed any disrupted routine. She told herself it with some conviction. On the 3rd day, she came home from delivering laundry to find a note tucked into the gap in the fence post he'd reset. The note said, "Hollis made his statement. Marshall's name is Aldridge. He's interested. Back Thursday." B. She stood at the fence reading it twice, then folded it and put it in her pocket and went inside and did not let herself feel as relieved as she actually was. He rode up Thursday afternoon rather than morning, which meant they'd pushed hard on the way back. She was at the lines when he came through the gate, and she could see from his posture and the set of his shoulders that it had gone all right. Not perfectly. This was not a man who came back from good news looking like he hadn't slept, but all right. "Aldridge is sending a deputy," he said without preamble. "He wants to review the notebook himself. Hollis's statement went into the official record this morning before we left. Tennant is being contacted through the Denver office directly." He stopped, looked at her. "Are you all right?" "Orson grabbed my arm," she said. The expression that moved across Bram's face was not simple. "He what?" "He came here the morning after you left. He knows I went to Polk. He grabbed my arm and told me to sign the paper." She kept her voice level. "I told him I knew about the cinch. I didn't plan to. It came out." Bram was very still. "Did he hurt you?" "No, I got my arm back." She looked at him. "I might have moved too fast. He knows I know. He doesn't know what I can prove." "How did he take it?" "Quietly." She paused. That was the part that scared me. Bram looked at the road, back at her. "Aldridge's deputy should be here within the week," he said. "Once a federal presence is in town, Orson's room to move narrows considerably." "What about Rourke?" "Aldridge is aware of the conflict of interest. He was..." Bram paused, choosing words. "He was not happy about the picture we were painting of a county sheriff, but he listened. He kept the notebook. He's a careful man." "Careful is good," she said. "Careful means he'll do it right." That's what I thought. He was still watching her face. "Mara, what you told Orson, that you knew about the cinch, I know, I shouldn't have. I wasn't going to say that." He came a step closer. "I was going to say that I think you were right to say it. He needs to know that you're not going to be frightened into silence. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is let someone understand they're already too late." She looked at him. The afternoon was going golden around them, the kind of late day light that turned the scrub pine and the fence posts into something more than they were. "Are we almost there?" she said. "In terms of what we have?" "Close." He held her gaze. "Not yet, but close." Close wasn't enough for what was coming. She understood that, and she understood that Orson understood it too, which was why the quiet expression on his face when she'd named the cinch had frightened her. A man who'd done what he'd done and still had room to move was a man who was already calculating his next step. She just didn't know what that step was yet. She found out 2 days later. She was coming back from the east side of town when she smelled it. Smoke. The particular smell of it, not wood smoke from a hearth, but the wide, open, acrid smell of something burning that shouldn't be burning. The smell of structure fire. The smell that made every person in the territory look up and look north automatically. She looked north. The smoke was coming from above the settlement, up where the old Caldwell mining camp sat abandoned on the hillside. Nobody used that camp anymore. The silver vein it had been sunk on had petered out a decade ago, and the buildings had been sitting empty since. But somebody was up there now. She started walking faster and then running, and she wasn't sure why she was running exactly. A fire at an abandoned mining camp wasn't her problem, until she heard someone in the street shout the word, "Records." She stopped. "What records?" she called to the man who'd shouted, a dry goods clerk she half knew, standing in his doorway. "Land office records," he said. "Somebody moved a bunch of territorial survey documents up to that camp for storage last month. Somebody from the county assessors." He was shading his eyes, looking at the smoke. "Never heard of putting records in an abandoned mining camp. Myself." Mara stood in the middle of the street with the smell of burning records in her nose and understood exactly what was happening. Orson was cleaning up. The survey documents, the territorial records of mineral claims and land surveys in this county, were burning. And if they burned, the independent corroboration of Gideon's notebook burned with them. Tenant's formal claim would need backup from the official territorial records. Without those records, the chain of evidence became thinner. Defensible to a good lawyer, maybe. Maybe. She turned and ran back the way she'd come. Bram was at his property, a mile east. She couldn't wait for him. She couldn't do this alone either. She ran to the nearest ranch she trusted, the Aldrich place, 50 yards off the main road, and pounded on the door until Walt Aldrich opened it with the expression of a man who'd been eating supper. "The mining camp," she said. "Records are burning. I need your wagon. I need it now." Walt Aldrich was a practical man married to a woman who'd been giving Mara laundry for 6 months. He looked at her face once and said, "5 minutes." She ran to the road and started toward the camp on foot while she waited. Bram found her. She didn't know how. She hadn't sent for him, hadn't had time, but she was halfway up the hill road when she heard the gray gelding behind her and looked back to find him coming hard. "I saw the smoke from my east pasture," he said, pulling up beside her. "What's happening?" "Orson's burning the survey records. They were moved to the Caldwell camp." She was breathing hard from running uphill. "Territorial surveys, the ones that would corroborate Gideon's notebook." Bram said a word she'd only heard from ranch hands and wheeled his horse uphill. She ran after him. Walt Aldrich's wagon caught up with her on the slope, and she climbed onto the bench beside him without asking, and they went up the rest of the road at a pace that made the wagon creak and rattle like it was protesting. The camp was 3 abandoned structures: a bunkhouse, a tool shed, and a records cabin that had been built sturdier than the others because paper needed dry and secure storage. The records cabin was the one burning. The fire had taken the roof and was working on the walls, and the dry timber was doing exactly what dry timber did. Bram was already off his horse. He'd seen the layout fast and understood what she hadn't had time to tell him. There was an irrigation ditch running along the hillside above the camp. Gideon had built it years ago to manage runoff from the upper slope. It still ran. She could hear it. "The ditch," she said, coming up beside him. "I see it. If we redirect it, the grade is wrong. It'll run south of the cabin." He was looking at the channel outlet, 20 feet up the slope. "But if we break the barrier at the secondary outlet, the lower channel." She knew this land. She'd ridden this hillside with Gideon a dozen times. "There's a wooden barrier blocking the lower outlet. Gideon put it in to prevent flooding the road. If we pull it..." "Show me." She went up the slope at a run, and Bram was beside her, and Walt Aldrich was behind them, shouting something about a bucket chain, but they didn't stop. The secondary outlet barrier was a set of stacked boards wedged into a channel notch. It was old and gray and swollen with 10 years of wet seasons. She grabbed the top board and pulled, and it didn't move. Bram was beside her in a second, both of them pulling, and it still didn't move, and she felt the heat of the fire at her back and smelled the smoke thickening, and she thought about the records in that cabin and what they meant and what would be lost if they burned. "Together," Bram said. They pulled. The boards gave with a sound like a gunshot, and the water came. It wasn't a flood. The ditch wasn't large enough for that, but it was a steady, fast-moving sheet of water that ran down the slope and hit the burning cabin wall broadside. The fire hissed. Steam billowed. Walt Aldrich's bucket chain. He'd organized 3 other men from the road in the time she and Bram had been at the barrier. Hit the structure from the other side. It took 40 minutes. At the end of those 40 minutes, the cabin was standing. Scorched badly on one wall, roof gone entirely, and the interior was a wet, blackened mess that smelled like disaster. But the walls had held, and the heavy iron document cabinets inside, the kind used specifically because they were fire-resistant, had done their job. The records were damaged but readable. Not all of them. Maybe 60%. But 60% was enough. Mara stood in the wet ash at the cabin doorway, covered in smoke and mud and the particular grime that came from fighting a fire in the wrong clothes, and looked at the iron cabinets. Bram was beside her. He had a burn on his left forearm from where a falling timber had caught him. He was looking at it with the expression of a man deciding how much something hurt. "How bad?" she said. "I'll live." He lowered his arm. "The records?" "Enough." She turned to look at him. It was Orson. "I know." He knew we were moving toward Denver. He knew about the territorial surveys. He's trying to eliminate corroboration. "Mara." Bram looked at her directly. "Attempting to destroy official territorial records is a federal offense. This isn't just murder anymore. This is a man who's been committing crimes in multiple directions for at least 14 months, and he just committed one more in front of witnesses." He glanced at Walt Aldrich, who was talking to the other men on the hillside, all of them looking at the smoldering cabin with the expression of people who understood that they'd just seen something significant. Whatever Orson thought he was doing, he just made it much easier to build a case. She thought about the expression on Orson's face when she'd named the cinch, the quiet calculation, the "you should have signed the paper." He hadn't been issuing a threat. He'd been telling her what he was going to do next. He'd moved to destroy evidence, and he'd failed. She looked at Bram. "We need to get to Rourke before Orson does," she said. "You want to go to Rourke?" "I want to walk into that sheriff's office while Orson is still thinking he's won, and I want to lay everything on the table. The notebook, Hollis's statement, Tennant's contact, the letter I sent to Aldridge, the arson we just witnessed." She met his eyes. If Rourke buries it again, he does it with federal eyes already on him. He's not stupid enough for that. Bram was quiet. "You're going to give him a chance to do the right thing," he said. "I'm going to give him a reason to do it. That's different." She looked at her hands, dirty, scraped, a small cut on her right palm from the barrier boards. "He has a choice between covering for Orson and saving himself. I'm going to make sure he understands clearly which one is still available to him." Something moved in Bram's expression that wasn't quite admiration and wasn't quite awe. It was more personal than either of those things, and she saw it before he could arrange his face into something neutral, and she stored it in the back of her mind without comment because this was not the moment. "All right," he said. "Let me get my arm looked at first." "Obviously." She turned toward the road. "And Bram?" "Yeah." "Thank you." "For the barrier." She paused. "For all of it." He didn't say, "Yep," this time. Honey said, "You were already running up that hill before I got here. I couldn't budge those boards alone. You'd have found a way." She looked at him. "Maybe, but I didn't have to." He held her gaze for a moment too long, the way he'd been doing more lately, and then he looked away first, and they walked down the hill together, through the smoke-smelling afternoon to the wagon where Walt Aldrich was waiting with the patient expression of a man who'd just watched something he planned to tell his grandchildren about. They went to Rourke at 4 o'clock. Bram had his arm wrapped in clean linen from the Aldrich kitchen. Mara had washed her face and changed her dress, which was the most she'd had time for. She'd brought the copies of her ledger notes, the copy of Hollis's written statement, and the letter she'd received from Polk about Tennant's willingness to come forward. The originals were already in Denver. Rourke was behind his desk when they walked in, and the expression on his face when he saw them together told her that he'd already heard about the fire. His eyes went from Mara to Bram to the folder under Mara's arm, and she watched him calculating. She sat down across from him without being invited. "I've sent a letter to Marshal Aldridge's office in Denver," she said. Hollis Crane gave a formal sworn statement to the marshal directly. "Chester Tennant has documentation of the silver survey on the North Ridge and has agreed to cooperate with federal proceedings. I have Gideon's field notebook, which is currently in Marshal Aldridge's possession." She set the folder on his desk. "What I'm putting in front of you is a summary of the case that Aldridge is already building." Rourke looked at the folder and didn't touch it. "And what happened up at the Caldwell camp today?" he said carefully. "Someone set fire to the building where territorial survey records had been recently moved. The records were partially saved." She held his gaze. "We have 3 witnesses who saw Orson Ellsworth's hired man on that road earlier today." Walt Aldrich had recognized him. He'd told them on the way down the hill. Rourke's face had gone very still. "You've been protecting him," Bram said. His voice wasn't angry, just flat and direct. "We both know what you told Hollis Crane about that cinch, and we both know what the correct response to that report should have been." Rourke looked at him. "You want to be careful what you say to me in my own office." "I want you to understand what the situation is," Bram said, "because the way we see it, you have a choice right now. You can sit on this, and when Aldridge's deputy arrives, which will be within the week, it becomes a question of what you knew and when. Or you can open a formal investigation today, on the record, and you become the sheriff who finally pursued justice when he had enough evidence to do it properly." Silence. The clock on Rourke's wall ticked. Mara watched his face and saw the moment the calculation resolved. She didn't feel triumph. She felt something quieter, the specific exhaustion of being right about something you'd spent months hoping you were wrong about. "I'll need to see the formal documentation from Aldridge's office before I move on any of this," Rourke said. "That's reasonable," Mara said. "And I'll need those witness statements." "You'll have them." He finally reached out and touched the folder, opened it, read the top page with the careful deliberateness of a man reading something that might change his life. "The Ellsworth Ranch," he said, without looking up. "The court ruling is expected next week." "I'm aware. If what you're saying about the silver deposit is accurate..." He stopped, turned a page. "It's accurate," she said. Rourke looked up at her. He was a man who'd made bad choices for what she suspected were complicated reasons. Loyalty, money, the particular smallness of small-town power. She didn't like him. She wasn't going to forgive him, but she could use him. "I'll send to Denver tonight," he said, independently, "to confirm what you've told me about Aldridge." "Do that," Bram said. Rourke looked at him, then back at Mara. "If this is what you say it is," she said. She stood up. Bram stood with her. At the door, she stopped and turned back. "Sheriff Rourke, one more thing." She kept her voice even. 8 months ago, a man who worked honestly and treated people decently went out on a horse with a cut cinch and came home in a box. His wife has been washing other people's laundry and fighting a fraudulent legal claim while the man responsible walked around this town with your protection. She paused. "I'm not asking you to feel bad about that. I'm telling you that what you do in the next week will determine which side of this history you end up on." She walked out. Bram was beside her on the boardwalk, and the late afternoon had gone the color of old copper, and somewhere up the hill the burned cabin was still putting out thin threads of smoke. "You all right?" he said. "Stop asking me that. When you stop looking like you're about to fall down, I'll stop asking." She almost laughed. Almost. "I'm not going to fall down." "I know." He was quiet for a step or two. "You were remarkable in there." "I was angry in there. That's different." "Maybe." He glanced at her sideways. Didn't look different. She thought about what came next. The deputy from Denver, the formal proceedings, Tennant's arrival, the court ruling, all of it still to move through, still uncertain, still possible to go wrong in a dozen ways. But Rourke had read the folder. Hollis's statement was in Denver. The notebook was in Denver. The territorial survey records were scorched and wet, but readable. And Orson Ellsworth had just set a fire that federal law enforcement was going to care about very much. She pulled her coat tighter against the evening chill. "I need to go home," she said. "I have laundry to finish." Bram looked at her. "You nearly fought a mountain fire today," he said, "and the Hendersons need their shirts back by Friday." She started walking. "Are you coming?" He fell into step beside her the way he did, steady and unhurried, and the town moved around them in the ordinary evening way that towns had. People going home, lamps coming on, the smell of supper from the houses along the road. She had so much still ahead of her, but for the first time in the 8 months, she felt like the road ran forward. Deputy Marshal Warren Fitch arrived on a Tuesday, which was a laundry day, which meant Mara was behind the cottage with wet hands and a basket full of the Henderson family's shirts when she heard the extra horse on the road and looked up to find Bram coming through her gate with a stranger beside him. Fitch was younger than she'd expected, maybe 28, with a clean-shaved face and the careful posture of a man who was aware that his authority was newer than his face suggested. He had a federal badge on his coat that caught the morning light, and he looked at her with the direct, assessing gaze of someone who'd been briefed and was now comparing the briefing to the reality. "Mrs. Ellsworth," he said, "Deputy Marshal Warren Fitch, out of Denver. Marshal Aldridge sends his regards." "Deputy." She dried her hands on her apron and came to meet him. "You made good time." Marshal Aldridge felt the situation warranted it. He glanced at the laundry lines, the cottage, the old washtub. She watched him take it in without comment, which she appreciated. "I've read your letter and reviewed the materials Mr. Calder and Mr. Crane brought to Denver. I have some questions." "I expected you would." She nodded toward the cottage door. "Come inside." They sat at the kitchen table. The same table where Orson had dropped his document weeks ago, which she thought about briefly and then set aside. And Fitch asked his questions with the methodical patience of a man who'd been trained to build a record rather than satisfy his own curiosity. He went through the cinch, the notebook, the ledger entries, Orson's confrontation of Gideon, the timing of the inheritance claim, the land office records being pulled, the fire at the Caldwell camp. He asked each thing twice, in different ways, which she recognized as checking for consistency. She didn't find it offensive. She answered every question the same way both times. Bram sat against the wall with his arms crossed and his burn-wrapped arm resting on his knee and didn't say much, which was the correct thing to do. This was her testimony. He understood that. At the end of an hour, Fitch closed his notebook and looked at her. "Sheriff Rourke contacted our office the night you spoke with him," he said. She hadn't known that. "What did he say?" He confirmed he was reopening the investigation into Gideon Ellsworth's death and requested federal oversight given the conflict of interest concerns. Fitch paused. He also named Orson Ellsworth as a person of interest in the arson at the Caldwell camp. She was quiet for a moment. He came forward on his own. He did. She thought about the calculation she'd watched Rourke make across his desk. Which side of history? She hadn't expected him to move that fast or that definitively, but here it was. That was the right thing, she said, even if it was also the practical thing. Often those are the same, Fitch said, which was more philosophical than she'd expected from a 28-year-old deputy marshal, and she revised her opinion of him upward. What happens now? Bram said from his corner. I'll meet with Sheriff Rourke this afternoon. I'll review the physical evidence, including the notebook and Crane's formal statement. Tennant is expected in Denver Thursday. His formal assessment of the mineral survey will go into the record. Fitch looked at Mara, and I need to speak with Orson Ellsworth. Her stomach tightened. He'll have a lawyer. He already does. A man named Purcell out of Denver. Expensive. Fitch said it without inflection. Mr. Purcell contacted our office yesterday, which suggests Mr. Ellsworth has been anticipating this. He's been anticipating it since I told him I knew about the cinch, Mara said. What exactly did you tell him? She explained the conversation on her step, the grip on her arm, what she'd said and what he'd said back. Fitch wrote it down. You should have reported the physical contact to Sheriff Rourke immediately, he said. At the time, I wasn't certain Rourke would do anything useful with the information. Fitch looked at her. That's fair, he said, and wrote something else down. When he left, she and Bram stood in the yard and watched his horse move up the road toward town. Purcell, Bram said. That's a serious lawyer. I know. Orson's going to fight this. I know. She looked at the laundry lines. The Henderson shirts were drying in the morning wind, going stiff the way cotton did when the air was dry. He's going to argue the cinch was where. He's going to argue the notebook is fabricated or misinterpreted. He's going to argue the fire at the camp was unrelated. Purcell is good at that kind of arguing. Then we need to make sure the evidence is better than Purcell's arguments. She picked up the empty basket. Did Hollis say anything about being cross-examined? He said he'd answer whatever he was asked. He was pretty calm about it. Bram paused. Hollis Crane is a man who's been bothered by something for 8 months. He'll be more relieved to say it clearly than scared of the pushback. And Tennant's documentation, bore samples, measurements, survey maps with his seal and signature. The kind of thing that doesn't bend under questioning. He looked at her sideways. You're running the arithmetic again. I'm always running the arithmetic. At some point, you're going to have to trust that the math adds up. At some point, she agreed, but not yet. He almost smiled. Didn't quite. What can I do? She thought about it honestly. Right now, nothing. This part moves without us. She looked at the road where Fitch had disappeared. The territorial court ruling is still expected within the week. Whatever happens with the criminal investigation, the civil case runs on its own track. If the ruling goes to Orson before the investigation produces anything formal, it won't reverse after, Bram said. Even if Orson is eventually convicted, a civil property ruling is a separate matter. Which is why I need to be at that courthouse when the ruling comes. I'll be there with you. You don't... Mara. He said it the way he said everything. Flat, direct, not asking. I'll be there. She looked at him. All right, she said. The ruling came on Friday. Not with any drama or ceremony. A clerk posted a notice at the courthouse door at 9 in the morning, which was how it was always done, and word spread through Red Willow crossing the way. Word always spread in small settlements, person to person, door to door, until Mara heard it from Mrs. Aldrich, who'd heard it from her husband, who'd seen the posting on his way to the feed store. She walked to the courthouse with Bram beside her and read the notice herself, because she needed to see the words directly. The court found Orson Ellsworth's inheritance claim without sufficient legal merit and ordered the Ellsworth Ranch returned in full to Mara Ellsworth's surviving spouse, with all associated land rights, water rights, and improvements intact. She read it 3 times. Bram read it once, then looked at her. She folded her hands in front of her and breathed. Well, she said. Well, he said. She stood on the courthouse step in the morning cold and waited for something large to happen inside her. Relief, or grief, or triumph, or something that matched the size of what she'd been fighting for. What she felt instead was quieter than that. Something more like the particular stillness that comes after a very long effort when the effort is finally done. The ranch was hers. It had always been hers. It was hers again on paper, which was the thing that had needed to be fixed. I should go out there, she said. To the ranch. Do you want to? Not today. She stepped down from the courthouse. Today, I want to finish the laundry. Bram looked at her. The laundry? The Henderson shirts need to come in before they get too stiff, and I owe Mrs. Coates a delivery. She started walking. The ranch has been there for 20 years. It will still be there tomorrow. He fell into step beside her. "You're a strange woman. Mara Ellsworth," he said. "Probably." She glanced at him. "Is that a complaint?" "No," he said, with the definitiveness of a man who meant it completely. Orson was arrested the following Monday. Deputy Fitch and Sheriff Rourke went together, which Mara thought was probably deliberate on Fitch's part, letting Rourke be part of the action rather than be superseded by it, giving him a visible role in the correction of his earlier failure. She didn't witness the arrest. She heard about it from 3 different people before noon, each version slightly different in the details but consistent on the central fact. Orson had been taken in quietly, his lawyer Purcell had appeared within the hour, and Orson had said nothing on the way to the jail except reportedly to ask whether the cell had a window. It did. South-facing. She didn't know why she cared about that detail, but she did. The charge was arson of territorial property. Additional charges relating to Gideon's death were described by Fitch as pending review of all evidence, which meant they were coming but carefully assembled. A federal case on a murder charge needed to be watertight before it was filed, and Fitch was building it watertight. She found herself sitting at her kitchen table that evening with a cup of tea going cold in front of her and nothing in particular to do. The laundry was done. The letter to her lawyer confirming the court ruling had been sent. She'd spoken to Fitch once more that afternoon, confirming a few details, and he'd told her to expect formal proceedings to begin within the month. The thing that had consumed 8 months of her life was no longer consuming her moment to moment. She didn't know what to do with her hands. She got up, went outside, stood under the cottonwood in the darkening evening. The washtub sat where it always sat, beside the fence, dented and practical, and absolutely without sentiment. She looked at it for a moment. She was not going to cry over a washtub. She went back inside. Chester Tennant arrived in Red Willow Crossing on a Wednesday, came through Ezra Polk's office first, and then to her cottage, which she took as a measure of the man. He had wanted to be introduced through someone he considered a neutral party before showing up at a widow's door alone. He was in his mid-40s, thin, with the precise movements of someone who spent a lot of time measuring things and didn't like imprecision. He had a leather satchel with him that he held with both hands, and she understood from that alone that the satchel contained what mattered. They sat at her kitchen table. "I'm sorry about Gideon," Tennant said before anything else. "He was a careful man. He didn't get excited about things until he was sure, and he was sure about that ridge." He looked at the satchel. "When he asked me to wait on the formal claim, I thought he was being overly cautious. In hindsight, you couldn't have known," she said. "No, but I've thought about it plenty." He set the satchel on the table. "I have the bore samples, the assay results, the survey maps with my certification, and my field notes from every day I spent on that ridge. It's thorough." "Deputy Fitch will need it for the federal record." "I know. I'm going to his office this afternoon." Tennant looked at her carefully. "Mrs. Ellsworth, I also need to tell you what the deposit means. In practical terms. Tell me." "The Galena Formation on the North Ridge, based on the bore samples and the seam extension measurements. This is not a small find." He chose his words with the care of a man who'd been wrong about optimistic estimates before and didn't want to be wrong again. Conservative production, run properly over a 10-year extraction period, would put the value of that deposit in the range of... He said a number. She looked at him. He repeated it. She set her teacup down. "That's..." She stopped. "Yes." He wasn't smiling exactly, but there was something in his expression that acknowledged the enormity of what he'd just said. "I want to be clear, that's a conservative estimate. Actual production value depends on ore grade consistency, extraction costs, market prices for silver, and how the operation is run." He paused. "But the deposit is real, it's substantial, and it's on your land." She sat with that for a moment. The woman who had been washing other people's laundry for 8 months to cover her lawyer's retainer was sitting across the table from a man who had just told her she was wealthy. Not comfortable, not secure, wealthy in a way that changed things structurally, the way only a certain kind of money could. She thought about Orson in his cell with the south-facing window. She thought about Gideon on the ridge with his field notebook, measuring the rock outcropping in the afternoon light, writing, "I think there's something up here," in his careful hand. She thought about what it had cost. "Thank you," she said, "for coming forward." "I should have done it 8 months ago," Tennant said. "I didn't know what had happened to Gideon until Polk's message reached me. When I understood..." He stopped, pressed his mouth into a line. "I should have made that formal claim the minute Gideon died. I didn't know it was anything but a tragic accident." "None of us knew," she said, "except the person who caused it." Tennant left for Fitch's office at 2. She sat at the table after he was gone and looked at the wall and tried to think practically about what came next, because thinking practically had gotten her through 8 months of impossible circumstances and she wasn't going to stop doing it now. The ranch. The cattle operation, which had been dormant for 8 months, could be restarted. She'd need hands. She'd need to repair equipment that had sat unused. She'd need to re-establish the relationships with cattle buyers that had gone cold while the estate was frozen. The silver deposit. She needed a mining lawyer. Not the one she'd retained for the civil case, someone who specialized in mineral rights and extraction agreements, someone from outside the county, someone with no existing relationship with anyone in Red Willow Crossing. She needed to understand what running a mine meant in practice. The workers, the equipment, the safety considerations. She'd heard enough about collapsed shafts and poisoned water tables and broken men to know that the way you ran a mine mattered as much as what was in the ground. She was still thinking about all of this 2 hours later when Bram knocked on the door. She'd heard his horse. She'd expected him to come by. "Tenant talk to you?" he said when she opened the door. "Yes, come in." He sat across from her at the same table. She told him the number Tenant had given her. Bram was quiet for a long moment. "That's a significant sum," he said. "I know." "Mara," he stopped, seemed to be choosing something carefully. "This changes things." "What things?" He looked at the table rather than at her. "I've been riding past your fence for 2 months, fixing posts and drainage channels and—" He stopped again, started differently. "When you were Gideon's widow with a washtub and a laundry line and a legal dispute, riding past your fence was something I did because I wanted to, and it didn't have any—" He was struggling with this, which she noticed because he was usually a man who said what he meant without struggling. It was simple. "Now you're going to be one of the wealthiest property owners in the county, and if I keep riding past your fence, people will say I know what they'll say," she said, "and they won't be entirely wrong to wonder." He looked at her then. "I don't want your money, Mara. I never thought about your money because there wasn't any money to think about. But now there is, and I can't—" He pressed his hand flat on the table. "I don't know how to keep doing what I've been doing without it looking like something it isn't." She looked at him. This large, steady, practical man who'd shown up at her fence every morning for 2 months and fixed things and asked honest questions and ridden to Denver with Hollis Crane and helped her pull a barrier apart on a burning hillside, and who was now sitting at her kitchen table trying to tell her that he was going to stop coming around because he was afraid of looking like he wanted something from her. She was tired. She'd been tired for 8 months. She didn't have patience for this particular kind of unnecessary problem. "Bram," she said. "Yeah. You wanted me when my fortune was a washtub, cracked hands, and somebody else's dirty sheets." He looked at her. His expression was complicated. "Don't become a coward just because I got rich," she said. The room was very quiet. He looked at his hand on the table, at her, back at his hand. "That's a direct thing to say," he said. "You're a direct person. I assumed you'd prefer it." He was quiet for another moment. Then something in him settled. She could see it happen, the way you could see a post go true when the final blow of the maul seated it properly. "I do prefer it," he said. "Good. I'm still going to worry about how it looks. Worry about it while you ride past my fence in the morning. It won't kill you." He looked at her steadily. "You're not going to make this easy on me. I've never made anything easy. Why would I start now?" And he did smile then, a real one, the kind that changed his whole face, and she looked at it carefully because she'd been wondering for a while what that would look like. She'd been right that it was worth seeing. The formal charges in Gideon's death were filed 3 weeks later. Fitch had been thorough. The charge was not manslaughter, but second-degree murder. The distinction being that while Orson claimed he'd cut the cinch only to cause an injury, not a death, the law did not look charitably on a man who'd tampered with a saddle knowing the horse would be ridden on mountain terrain at speed. Purcell fought it. Purcell fought everything with the expensive, methodical energy of a Denver lawyer who'd been paid to be an obstacle. He argued the cinch was where. He argued the notebook was circumstantial. He argued Tennant's survey was preliminary and non-binding. He argued the fire at the Caldwell camp had no demonstrable connection to his client. He was good. Mara sat through 2 days of preliminary proceedings and watched Purcell work and understood why Orson had hired him specifically. But there was a problem with Purcell's approach that no amount of skill could fully address. The evidence was what it was. A clean cut on a leather cinch documented by Hollis Crane, who'd handled enough harnesses to know the difference. A field notebook with Gideon's initials and dated entries leading directly to a confrontation with Orson. A silver survey with a certified assessor's signature, and Orson himself who had, in front of Mara, demonstrated awareness of the North Range survey before any public knowledge of it existed. There was also the arson. The arson was the thing that hurt Orson most, because it happened after the fact, after all the other evidence existed, and a man only burned records he was afraid of. That was the argument Fitch made, and it was simple, and it stuck. On the fourth day of preliminary proceedings, Orson asked to speak. His lawyer advised against it. Mara could see Purcell's expression from where she sat. The controlled frustration of a man watching a client overrule good counsel. But Orson stood up and spoke anyway, and what he said was not a confession and not a denial, but something in between. The kind of statement a man made when he'd been cornered so thoroughly that partial admission felt like the only remaining card. He said he'd cut the cinch. He said he'd intended it to cause an injury, not a death. That he'd calculated a stumble, a fall, a broken arm or leg that would keep Gideon off the ridge for the weeks Orson needed to file his own mineral claim. He said it had gone wrong. He said the ravine had been an accident within the act. Mara sat in the gallery and listened to Orson explain the arithmetic of how he'd decided to gamble with her husband's life, and she kept her face still the way she'd been keeping it still for months, and she did not look away from him. After, in the hallway outside the courtroom, Fitch came to find her. "It helps and it doesn't help," he said, meaning the statement. "I know." She understood what Orson had done. By admitting the cinch while disputing the intent, he'd complicated the second-degree murder charge. A good defense lawyer could now argue for a reduced charge. Purcell would argue very hard. "It's still an admission," Fitch said, "of the tampering, of the deliberate act that doesn't go away regardless of how the intent question is resolved." "What does it mean for the outcome?" "I think he goes to prison," Fitch said directly. "How long depends on what a jury decides about intent, but he goes." He paused. "I wanted you to hear that from me directly, not through a lawyer or a courthouse rumor." She looked at him. "I was young, this deputy marshal, but he was careful and he was honest and he'd done his job with the kind of seriousness that the situation had deserved." "Thank you," she said, "for all of it." He nodded once and went back into the courthouse. She stood in the hallway for a moment, then walked outside into the cold afternoon air. Bram was at the bottom of the courthouse steps. He'd been in the gallery too, 2 rows behind her, and she'd been aware of him there the whole time in the way she was aware of him generally, as a steady presence at a particular location, reliable, not intruding. He came up to her, looked at her face. "He admitted it," she said. "I heard." "He said it wasn't supposed to kill him." She looked at the street. "He said the ravine was an accident." Bram was quiet. "He chose the knife," she said. The words came from somewhere clean and clear inside her. "Whatever the ravine decided after, he chose the knife. He made that decision, and then he walked away and came to my husband's funeral and shook my hand and told me he was sorry for my loss." She said it without her voice breaking, which surprised her a little. "Yes," Bram said, "that's what I need a jury to understand. Not the ravine, the knife. They will." She wasn't sure about that. Juries were not machines. They were 12 people with their own arithmetic. But she was going to do everything in her power to make sure they had what they needed to understand. And that was the only control she had over any of it. So that's what she'd use. The mine assessment arrived the following week, and with it came 3 men from Denver who wanted to talk about development contracts. She met them in her lawyer's office, all 4 of them slightly surprised by her. She could see it. The quick recalibration when a woman in practical work clothes sat across the table and asked specific questions about ore extraction rates and shaft safety requirements and worker compensation terms. She'd prepared for 3 days. She knew what she was asking about. The negotiation took most of a morning. At the end of it, she had a preliminary agreement that required safety inspections before any shaft went below 40 feet, a wage structure that was above standard, and a stipulation that the ranch water supply could not be affected by mining operations without her written approval. The Denver men had come expecting to set terms and left having received them, and she could see in their expressions a mixture of respect and mild affront that she found privately satisfying. Her lawyer, a small, careful man named Greer, who'd spent 8 months telling her things would likely or probably go one way or another, shook her hand when they left. "That was well done," he said. "I know what the land is worth," she said, "and I know what it cost." That afternoon, she rode to the Ellsworth Ranch for the first time. She went alone. She needed to do this part alone. The gate was padlocked. It had been padlocked since the court froze the estate, and she had to find the key in her bag and work with it in the cold air, and the lock was stiff from months of disuse. She got it open. The house was cold and still and smelled like closed-up rooms and old wood. The furniture was where it had always been. The kitchen was exactly as she'd left it the morning she'd moved to the cottage. The morning she'd understood that she couldn't maintain a full ranch house alone on what she was making from laundry. She walked through every room. She stood for a long time in the front room, where Gideon's books were still on the shelf, where his reading chair was still at the angle he'd preferred, close to the lamp. She didn't touch anything. She just stood. She wasn't going to perform grief for herself. She'd done her grieving in pieces over 8 months. 4 minutes against a cottonwood tree, a long night reading ledger entries, the particular silence of a bedroom that used to hold 2 people and now held 1. She was done apologizing to the empty rooms for still being alive. She closed the front door behind her, got back on her horse, and rode back to the cottage. Tomorrow she'd start making lists. Hands to hire, equipment to assess, contractors to meet, lawyers to brief. The ranch and the mine and the legal case and the life ahead of her were all real and all demanding, and she was the only person who could manage them. She pulled up at her own gate. Bram's gray gelding was tied at the fence post. She dismounted, tied the mare beside him, and found Bram in her kitchen with a pot of coffee on the stove, which he'd apparently made himself using her kitchen without asking, which she noted without comment because she found she didn't actually mind. He handed her a cup. "How was it?" he said. "Empty." She drank. "Cold. I'll need to air it out before I move back." "When are you thinking?" "A week, maybe 2. There's a lot to organize." She looked at him over her cup. "You've been making yourself comfortable in my kitchen? Your coffee tin was running low." He settled back against the counter. "I brought more." She looked at the counter. There was a new tin of coffee next to the old one. She looked at him. "You brought me coffee," she said. "Running low," he said again, as if this explained everything completely. She thought about a man who fixed fence posts and pulled barrier boards on burning hillsides and rode to Denver with a ranch hand's testimony and showed up to courthouse proceedings 2 rows behind her where she could feel his steadiness without having to see it, and who now stood in her kitchen having brought coffee because she was running low. She thought about the fence. The one he'd fixed the 3rd morning he'd stopped, solid and true. "Bram," she said. "Yeah." "I'm going to have a very complicated year. I know. The mine, the ranch, the court case. There will be businessmen from Denver and lawyers and people who think they can negotiate me into something I don't want." She set her cup down. "I'm not going to be easy to be around." He looked at her steadily. "You've never been easy to be around. I'm still here. I'm going to need..." She stopped. This was harder than the negotiation with the Denver men, harder than the courthouse, harder than most things she'd done, because this was not practical, or not only practical, and she didn't have a script for it. "I'm going to need someone who treats me like I can understand things. Like, my opinion is worth considering." She paused. "Like, I'm not just someone to be managed." "I know," he said. "You've always done that." "I know that too." She looked at him. He looked back at her. Neither of them said the obvious thing, because neither of them was the kind of person who said obvious things when the other person could already see them clearly. "The Henderson shirts are done," she said finally. "I noticed. It's the last delivery I'm taking." She looked at her hands, rough at the knuckles. The cut on her right palm was healing to a thin scar. "I'm not going to need the laundry money anymore." "No, I'm keeping the wash tub." He didn't ask why. He just nodded, the way he nodded when something made sense to him without requiring explanation. Outside, the cottonwood was doing its thing in the evening wind, and the mountains were going dark at their edges, and Mara Ellsworth stood in her kitchen drinking coffee brought by a man who'd ridden past her fence every morning for 2 months and never once looked at her like she needed saving. She thought, "I have a ranch to run, a mine to manage, a court case to see through, a life to rebuild from the specific wreckage of the last 8 months. She thought, "I am so tired, and the tired goes so deep it has layers she hasn't gotten to yet." She thought, "I am still here." That last thing, quietly, felt like the most important of the 3. The week Mara moved back into the Ellsworth ranch house, it rained for 3 days straight. Not the gentle kind of rain that settled dust and filled creeks quietly. The kind that came off the mountain sideways, that found every gap in window framing and every soft spot in a roof that had gone untended for 8 months, that turned the yard to mud and made the cattle operation she was trying to restart feel immediately and practically impossible. She moved boxes in the rain. She found the leak over the back bedroom in the rain. She discovered that the root cellar had taken on water and lost a portion of the preserved stores she'd left there the previous autumn, and she stood at the top of the cellar steps looking at the damage with a lamp in her hand and felt the specific, unglamorous frustration of a person trying to rebuild something practical in impractical conditions. Bram showed up on the second day with roofing materials and Hollis Crane, who had driven his wagon up from Sutter's Creek because, he told her without sentiment, he had nothing pressing that week and the ranch would need more hands than she currently had. She looked at them both standing in her yard in the rain. I didn't ask for help, she said. No, Hollis agreed, pulling his collar up. You want us to leave? She looked at the roof, at the roofing materials in the wagon, at the mud. The back bedroom is the worst, she said. There's a seam that's gone along the east eave. They were up there within the hour. She brought them coffee at noon and stood in the yard looking up at two men on a wet roof in the rain and thought about the particular strangeness of her life at this specific moment. The court case pending, the mine contracts drafted, the ranch coming back to life around her in fits and starts, and these two men on her roof who'd both, in their different ways, decided she was worth showing up for. Hollis stayed 3 days. He slept in the bunkhouse, which needed airing but was structurally sound, and in those 3 days, he fixed the roof, reset 2 fence sections that had collapsed over the winter, and helped her assess the condition of the equipment she'd in a methodical way that told her he'd been thinking about coming back here for some time. On the last morning, over breakfast in the ranch kitchen that was finally warm enough to sit in comfortably, she asked him directly, "Would you want to stay on?" He looked at his coffee. "As foreman?" he said, "if you wanted that, or as a hand to start if you'd rather see how things go first." "I know how things go with you," he said. "I watched you for 2 years before—" He stopped. "Before everything. You ran this place well. Gideon ran it well, but you ran it too. You knew which pastures to rotate. You knew when a calf was in trouble before the hands did. You just never got credit for it," she said. "No." He drank his coffee. "Foreman suits me fine, if it suits you." "It suits me." He nodded once. That was the whole negotiation. She paid him what she intended to pay him, which was more than the previous foreman had made, and he didn't argue about it, which told her he understood what the job was going to require. Bram came by that evening. Not with a project or an errand or a reason she could point to. He came by the way he'd always come by, with the easy, unhurried manner of a man who knew where he was supposed to be and didn't require an elaborate justification for being there. They sat on the porch in the late light, the rain finally done, the evening air with that particular washed clean smell that followed mountain storms. She'd brought out coffee. He'd brought nothing, which was itself a kind of comfort the first time he'd shown up empty-handed without a tool or a supply or a problem to fix. She noticed. "Hollis is staying," she said. "I heard. Good." He stretched his legs out. "He's a solid man." "He is." She looked at the yard. The mud was drying at the edges. The mountains across the valley were still dark with cloud. "Bram, I need to ask you something." "All right." "The night I moved the things from the cottage, when I was packing the last of it, I found something in the kitchen drawer. Gideon's." He waited. A letter. He'd started it and not finished it. Dated about a month before he died. She paused. He wrote it to Orson. He was trying to offer Orson a share of the mineral find, a fair portion as a peace offering to avoid whatever conflict he could see building. She stopped. He was trying to be generous to a man who'd already decided to kill him. Bram was quiet. "I've been thinking about it for 2 weeks," she said. "What it means that he tried. What it means that he didn't know how far gone Orson already was." "What do you think it means?" She looked at the mountains. "I think it means Gideon was a better person than the situation deserved," she said. "And I think that's not a lesson in being naive. It's something else." I didn't decide Orson was unreachable. He tried to reach him. That's different from being foolish. Bram turned his coffee cup in his hands. "You're working out whether to be angry at him for not knowing," he said. She looked at him. He was right, and it surprised her that he'd said it so plainly. "Yes," she said. "Are you?" "A little." She was quiet. "And then I'm angry at myself for being angry at him, because he's the one who's dead, and I'm the one still here sorting through his things and his unfinished letters, and—" She stopped, set her cup down. "I'm tired of the arithmetic of grief. I'm tired of working out what I owe him and what he left me and what I'm allowed to feel about all of it." "You're allowed to feel whatever you actually feel," Bram said. "That's not math." "It feels like math." "I know." He looked at her directly. "But I don't think it is. I think you loved him and he's gone, and what happened to him was wrong, and you fought to make it right, and all of that is true at the same time, without any of it canceling out any other part." She looked at him for a long moment. "You're better at this than I expected," she said. "I've had some practice," he said. and didn't elaborate, and she understood there were things in his own history she didn't know yet. Losses or difficulties that had given him the particular quiet that made him useful in situations like this one. She picked her cup back up. "I want to keep the letter," she said. "The unfinished one." "Then keep it." "Is that strange?" "No." He looked at the mountains. "It's the truest thing about him that you found. A man still trying, right at the end. That's worth keeping." They sat there as the light went out of the sky and the first stars appeared, and she thought about Gideon's unfinished letter and Orson's south-facing cell and Hollis on the roof in the washtub, still sitting behind the cottage on the property she no longer lived in, and she thought about the specific texture of the past year and what it had made of her. She was not the person she'd been before. She knew that. The woman who'd stood in this yard on ordinary mornings watching Gideon saddle his horse hadn't known yet what she was capable of, hadn't been tested in the specific ways that showed you the shape of yourself under pressure. She didn't know if that woman would have recognized this one, but she thought she would have respected her. That felt like enough. The trial of Orson Ellsworth began 6 weeks later and lasted 4 days. Purcell was as skilled as advertised. He worked the intent question hard. The difference between a man who'd meant to injure and a man who'd meant to kill, the way that difference might or might not affect a jury's understanding of the charge. He put 2 character witnesses on the stand who said things about Orson that were technically true and entirely beside the point. He asked Chester Tennant questions designed to make the Silver Survey sound less certain than it was. Tennant didn't waver. Mara had expected him to, a little. He was a careful man, and careful men sometimes became cautious under pressure in ways that read as uncertainty. But Tennant had been carrying this for 14 months, and he answered every question with the quiet precision of a man reading from a document he'd written himself, because he had. Hollis was the same. He described the cinch. He described what he'd said to Rourke and what Rourke had said back. He described the 8 months he'd spent uncertain whether anyone would ever do anything with what he knew. When Purcell asked him whether he could be certain a cut and a fray looked different after a fall down a ravine, Hollis looked at him calmly. "I've been working with horses and tack for 23 years, he said. "I know what I saw." Purcell let it go. Mara testified on the 3rd day. She sat in the witness chair and looked at Purcell and answered what she was asked and volunteered nothing, which her lawyer had told her was correct procedure and which also happened to be her natural instinct. She described the cottage break-in and the ledger search. She described Orson's visits and his increasing pressure. She described the morning he'd grabbed her arm. She described telling him she knew about the cinch and the expression on his face. Not shock, not denial, just that cold calculation. Purcell asked, "Isn't it possible you misread a man who was simply frustrated and distressed about a family property dispute?" She looked at him. A man who is frustrated and distressed does not hear his dead cousin's wife accuse him of murder and respond by calculating, she said. He responds, "Mr. Ellsworth calculated. I know the difference." Purcell moved on. She was in the witness chair for 2 hours. When she stepped down, she walked back to her seat in the gallery and sat beside Bram, who was where he always was, steady, present, not intruding. And she let herself feel the exhaustion of the last 2 hours sink into her bones. "All right?" he said quietly. "Don't ask me that." "Right." She almost laughed. "Yes, I'm all right." Orson took the stand on the 4th day, against Purcell's advice, the same way he'd spoken during preliminary proceedings. She understood this about him now. He was a man who believed in his own narrative so completely that he thought telling it clearly would matter. He'd spent his life being persuasive and charming and getting what he wanted through the force of his own presentation, and some part of him believed that if he just explained himself properly, people would understand. He explained that Gideon had been unreasonable, that the silver fine was on land Orson had a legitimate historic claim to, that he'd been desperate, not malicious, that the cinch had been a moment of bad judgment, not a calculated plan, that the ravine had been an accident, a terrible accident, and he'd spent 14 months living with the weight of it. He cried a little. Mara wasn't sure if it was real or performed, and she didn't particularly care. The jury was out for 3 hours. They came back with second-degree murder. Orson would go to prison. The sentence, determined by the judge 2 days later, was 15 years, with the possibility of earlier review dependent on conduct and the evolving territorial legal standards. Purcell said he'd appeal. Fitch told Mara the appeal had slim grounds given the volume and quality of the evidence. She stood outside the courthouse afterward in the afternoon light and felt the thing she'd been waiting to feel. Not triumph, still not triumph, which she'd stopped expecting. Something quieter. The particular feeling of a door closing on a room you never wanted to be in, the click of the latch, the finality of it. Bram came and stood beside her. He didn't say anything for a while. Is it enough? He asked finally. He meant the verdict, the sentence, all of it. She thought about it honestly. It's what the law could do, she said. I've decided that's separate from what I feel. The law did its job. What I feel about Gideon is mine, not the court's. That's a hard line to draw. Yes, but it's the right one. She looked at the courthouse door. 15 years. He'll be an old man when he gets out, if he gets out. That's a real consequence. I'm going to let it be real without needing it to fix everything, because it can't fix everything, and expecting it to would just be another way of not moving forward. Bram was quiet beside her. I've been thinking, he said. About what? About your fence. She looked at him. The one I reset that third morning, he said. It's been 11 weeks. That post will need checking again before winter. The ground shifts when it freezes. I know how fence posts work, she said. I know you do. He looked at her steadily. I'm telling you, I'm going to come check it, and the one beside it, and probably the drainage channel behind the laundry area, which will silt up again by October. I'm not doing laundry anymore. The channel will still silt. She looked at him. He looked back at her. The afternoon was warm, and the courthouse square was emptying, and somewhere down the street someone was frying something that smelled like onions, and she was standing with a man who was using a fence post to say something that neither of them was going to say directly yet, because neither of them was a person who said things before they were ready, and this was not quite the moment. But it was close. Come check the post, she said. I will. And Bram. Yeah. Don't make me wait too long. He looked at her for a moment with that expression, the one she'd catalogued and stored and thought about more than she'd admitted to herself. And then he nodded once. I won't, he said. A week later, he came to the ranch. Not to the cottage. She'd left the cottage locked and tidy with the washtub in its place behind it, and she'd go back to collect the last few things when she had time, but she was sleeping in the ranch house now, which felt both strange and increasingly like the right thing. He came on a Sunday, which was unusual for him. He didn't ride past the gate the way he sometimes still did from habit. He came through it, up the drive, got down at the porch. He wasn't carrying tools. She came out when she heard the horse, wiping her hands on a cloth, because she'd been working on the ranch accounts and her hands had ink on them, which was not exactly how she'd imagined this moment looking, but that was fine. Real things didn't wait for your hands to be clean. He stood at the bottom of the porch steps. I've been trying to think of a good way to do this, he said. How's that going? Poorly. He looked at his hat, which he was holding. I thought about bringing something. Flowers seemed wrong. Firewood seemed too practical. You brought me coffee last time. I know. I've been thinking about that too. He looked up at her. The truth is, I don't have a good way to do this because there isn't one. It's just a thing you say or you don't, and I've been not saying it for 2 months because I was afraid of what it would look like, and then you told me not to be a coward, so. She sat down on the porch step. Not to make it easier for him, but because she wanted to be at a level where she could see his face properly. So, she said, I'm asking you to marry me. He said it plainly, the way he said things, without embellishment. Not because you need protection or a man to run things. You have demonstrated pretty clearly you don't need either. Not because of the ranch or the mine or any of it. He paused. Because somewhere between fixing your fence and riding to Denver and pulling those boards apart on a burning hill, I fell completely in love with you. And I've been trying to talk myself into a practical way to frame that, and there isn't one. It's just true. She looked at him. She thought about the morning he'd first stopped and said, morning, and she'd been wringing out a shirt and hadn't looked up right away because she'd learned not to look up at every sound. She thought about coffee on the fence rail and the line shack on the north ridge and the feel of those barrier boards finally giving way under both their hands. She thought about 2 rows behind her in the courthouse gallery, steady and present and not intruding. She thought about Gideon's unfinished letter, still in her drawer, a man still trying, right at the end. She was a different woman from the one who'd stood at this fence 8 months ago. Not harder. She'd been afraid of becoming harder, had watched for it, but more complete somehow. More herself. The seasons she'd survived hadn't taken from her so much as they'd stripped away the parts that weren't essential, left her with the bones of what she actually was. And what she actually was, standing here on a Sunday morning with ink on her hands and a man she'd built something real with looking at her from the bottom of her porch steps, was someone who knew her own mind. I have conditions, she said. He didn't look surprised. I expected you might. The ranch stays in my name. Obviously. I run the mine negotiations. You can have opinions, I'll consider them. I'd expect nothing less. If you disagree with me about something significant, you say it directly and we talk it through. No managing me around to a conclusion. No letting things go and being quietly resentful. Agreed. Same from you. She looked at him. I'm not an easy person to be married to, she said. You're not an easy person in general, he said. I've noticed. I'm asking anyway. Then yes, she said. He stood there for a moment as if the word had taken a second to arrive fully. Yes, she said again. He came up the steps and she stood up and he was right in front of her, and she thought he might say something more, but instead he just took her rough, ink-stained hand in both of his and held it, and that was enough. It was the right amount of enough, the practical, human, real amount. They married in November, which was late enough in the season that the cottonwoods had gone gold and then bare, and the mountains were getting their first hard snow on the upper elevations, and the air had the particular clarity that came when the last of the summer haze was gone for good. It was a small wedding. Hollis stood with Bram. Ezra Polk and Walt Aldrich and his wife were there, and Tennant had come down from Alamosa, and Fitch had sent a letter that arrived the morning of. The ceremony was short and direct and contained no language about obeying or belonging to, because Mara had read the standard wording and told the officiant which parts she'd be omitting. The officiant had looked at her and then at Bram, who nodded. They'd said the parts that mattered. Afterward, in the ranch house that was warm and lit and full of people eating and talking, Hollis found her in the kitchen, where she'd gone to get more coffee, which was a habit she apparently couldn't shake even at her own wedding. Gideon would have liked him, Hollis said. She looked at him. He would have taken a while to admit it, Hollis added, with the particular honesty of a man who'd known Gideon well. He was a little stubborn, but he would have seen what Calder is. She poured 2 cups and handed him one. What is he? She asked. A man who shows up, Hollis said. In my experience, that's most of what matters. She thought about that for a moment. In mine too, she said. The silver operation began the following spring. She'd spent the winter doing exactly what she told herself she would, hiring carefully, reading everything she could about mine operations in the territory, talking to workers and engineers and one woman in Durango who'd inherited a mine from her father and had 17 years of experience running it. That woman, a sharp-eyed 60-year-old named Frances Hobart, became the most useful conversation Mara had that entire year. Frances talked to her for 3 hours, told her every mistake she'd made, and said at the end, "The men will test you. They always do. Not all of them, but enough. Don't let the ones who do make you harder than you need to be, because you need to stay clear-headed and anger makes you cloudy." Mara thought about that a lot. The contracts she'd negotiated, the safety requirements, the wage structure, the water protections, went into effect when the first shaft sank. There were men who thought she'd be softer in practice than she'd been in negotiation. They found out she wasn't. There were men who thought Bram ran things from behind her. He corrected that misunderstanding himself, directly and without drama, which she appreciated more than she said. The ranch ran alongside the mining operation, separate but adjacent, the cattle and the silver finding a rhythm, together the way things did when they were managed rather than just exploited. Hollis ran the ranch side with the steady competence of a man who'd been waiting for the right situation and had found it. Mara ran the mine side and the finances of both. There were hard months. A shaft problem in August that cost them 3 weeks and more money than she'd budgeted for. A disagreement with the Denver contracting firm that required 2 trips to the city and 1 very long and unpleasant meeting before it was resolved. An early winter that came down hard in October and took 200 head of cattle further than she'd been prepared for. She and Bram disagreed about the cattle loss, how much it would affect the following year's operation, whether to buy replacement stock immediately or wait. They sat at the kitchen table and argued about it for an hour, both of them wrong in different ways, and came to a third solution that was better than either of their originals. Afterward, Bram said, "I still think you're underestimating the spring market." "You might be right," she said. "We'll know by May." "I'll remind you in May. I expect you will." She looked at him across the kitchen table. This practical, steady, imperfect man who had never once looked at her like she needed rescuing, who disagreed with her when he thought she was wrong and told her directly and then let her decide, who had loved her when she was poor and moved into a life she was building without needing to be the one building it. She thought sometimes about what her life would have looked like if Orson had succeeded. If she'd signed, if Bram had never stopped at her fence, if the cinch had never been found, if Hollis had swallowed his knowledge, if the ledger entries had burned with the camp records. She didn't spend much time there. The past was the past, and you could look at it honestly without living in it. But she was aware, in a way she carried with her most days, of the specific improbability of where she'd ended up. Not because she was lucky. She didn't think of it as luck. She'd worked, and Hollis had taken a risk, and Bram had shown up every morning, and Tennant had kept his documentation, and Fitch had done his job carefully, and all of those things together were less about luck than about the accumulation of choices made by ordinary people who decided the truth was worth pursuing even when it was inconvenient and uncomfortable and potentially dangerous. That felt important to her, the accumulation of it. Sheriff Rourke publicly acknowledged his failure the following spring, at a county meeting that nobody had expected him to call. He stood in front of whatever crowd showed up and said, plainly, that he had failed in his investigation of Gideon Ellsworth's death, that he had allowed personal relationships to compromise his professional judgment, and that he was recommending the county adopt formal protocols for investigating suspicious frontier deaths regardless of the victim's status or the investigating officer's existing relationships with parties involved. It was not a comfortable speech, and he didn't make it comfortable. He stood there and said the true things and let them be true. Mara was in the crowd. Afterward, she didn't speak to him. She didn't need to. She'd said what she had to say to Rourke in his office months ago, and he'd heard it, and this was the result. That was the whole of what she needed from him. But she noticed on her way out that several other people in that room were watching Rourke with expressions that suggested they were revising their understanding of him. Not forgiving, necessarily. Revising. Deciding whether the man standing up at the front of the room making the uncomfortable speech was someone different from the man who'd dismissed Hollis Crane's report on a cut cinch. She thought that was probably the right response to what he'd done. Not immediate absolution. Watching. Waiting to see whether the words were the beginning of something or the end of it. She drove home in the late afternoon and thought about what it meant that a man had looked at the worst decision of his career and chosen to say it out loud instead of pretending it hadn't happened. She'd spent 8 months being angry at Rourke. She wasn't going to spend the next 8 months in a different configuration of that same feeling. She was going to let him try to be better, watch from a reasonable distance, and get on with her life. Getting on with her life was something she was getting good at. The first autumn after everything settled, she and Bram rode to Blackstone Gorge. It was an ordinary Saturday, no occasion. She'd suggested it over breakfast and he'd said yes, and they'd packed food and ridden out by mid-morning. The mine operation was running on the lower sections of the ridge. The gorge itself was quieter, the way it had always been. The high rock face throwing long shadows in the October light. They sat on the edge with their horses ground-tied behind them and ate the food she'd packed. Bread and cheese and dried apples, nothing elaborate. And looked at the valley below and the mountain above. Gideon sat up here, she said, looking at this and knowing what was in it. Did he tell you he loved it? The North Range? He told me he loved all of it, the whole property. She looked at the aspens on the lower slope, gone gold. He was the kind of person who meant that literally. He didn't just love what the land could produce. He loved the land. You're that way too, Bram said. She looked at him. Am I? The way you talked about the irrigation channel when we were fixing it. The way you knew the grade of the slope before you saw it. You know this land the way you know the inside of your own house. He paused. That's love, just a different kind. She thought about this. She thought about a woman who had spent 8 months scrubbing other people's laundry and fighting a fraudulent legal claim and sleeping poorly in a cottage that wasn't her home, and how that woman had somehow come through to this, sitting on a ridge above a valley she owned, beside a man she'd chosen freely, with a life that was complicated and difficult and fully hers. She thought about what it had taken. Not just the bravery of doing the dramatic things, pulling the barrier boards, walking into Rourke's office, sitting in the witness chair. Those were the visible moments. The invisible work was the other kind. The 4 minutes against a cottonwood tree, the decision to get back up every morning, the choice not to let grief decide what came next, or fear silence what needed to be said, or the money, once it arrived, change who she fundamentally was. She thought about Gideon's unfinished letter. A man still trying, right at the end. She was still trying too, not from the same desperate place. The desperation had burned itself out somewhere in the middle of all of it, somewhere between the line shack and the courtroom, somewhere in the ordinary daily accumulation of work and decisions and showing up. She was trying now from something steadier than desperation, from choice. She'd learned something about herself over the past 14 months that she suspected she wouldn't have learned any other way, which was that her lowest season had not decided the rest of her life. She had decided the rest of her life, not by being exceptional, She didn't think of herself as exceptional. She thought of herself as someone who'd done the next necessary thing each time the next necessary thing became clear. But those small decisions, compounded over months, had produced something. Had produced her. She was still not perfect. She still ran the arithmetic of grief some nights when she couldn't sleep. She still said too little when she should say more, and then too much at the wrong moment. She still sometimes stood at the window of the ranch house in the early dark and felt the old weight, the specific gravity of loss that never went away entirely and wasn't supposed to. But the weight didn't run her anymore. She ran it. "I used to think," she said, "that surviving something meant you came out the other side and the hard part was behind you." Bram looked at her. "It doesn't work that way," she said. "You carry it. It just gets proportional, eventually. The life around it gets large enough that the weight of it makes sense." He was quiet for a moment. "That's true," he said. "How long did it take you?" She was asking about the things she didn't know yet, the history he'd offered in pieces over months, a brother lost to a mine accident years back, a family property that hadn't survived the aftermath of that grief. She knew the shape without all the details. "Longer than I wanted," he said. "Less long than I thought it would." She nodded. The valley below caught the afternoon light, and the aspens went from gold to copper as the sun moved, and the gorge above them was full of shadow, and she could hear the faint sound of the mine operation on the lower ridge, a regular mechanical sound that meant people working, wages paid, shafts inspected, a thing running the way it was supposed to run. "We should head back," she said. "Yeah." Neither of them moved for another few minutes. She looked at the mountain above and the valley below and this man beside her who'd ridden past her fence every morning for 2 months before anything happened, who'd shown up with coffee and roofing materials and no flowers, who'd sat 2 rows behind her in a courthouse and said exactly the right number of words, which was usually very few. She thought, love that stands beside strength is a different thing from love that tries to replace it. She'd learned that the hard way and the right way, both at once. She thought, a person's lowest season is not their last word. The washtub behind the cottage and the silver in the mountain were both true at the same time, and neither one canceled the other, and the truth of both was just her life, complete hers. She got up and brushed off her coat and went to her horse. Bram was beside her. They rode down from Blackstone Gorge as the afternoon went to early evening, the trail familiar under the horses' feet, the mountains going dark at their edges the way they always did, the lights of the valley appearing one by one below them as they descended, ordinary and warm and real. She was home.